Arel knew about this. Arel emphasizes that both Asha and her brother must win. In other words, if only one of them is defeated, the victory goes to Gadel. Gadel thinks this came out of nowhere. However, if they win, it would greatly help their family, not to mention that victory seems certain. He thinks his brother is 2 years older than Eret, which gives them a physical advantage. As for himself, he would win easily, as he was the captain of the 13th Night Order. An escort knight would not be able to defeat him. Gadel bows and says that if it is the prince's will, he cannot refuse. The protagonist says he promises in his name and the name of the royal family, so there is no turning back for either side. Asha shouts at Arel and says that normally she wouldn't care, but this time he went too far. He says that normally she would try to stop him. She says that's not what she meant. The protagonist says that he really went too far. However, he asks her if she would be okay, knowing that this is happening and nothing was done. Arel says that Gadel not only ridiculed the Pernil family, but also humiliated her younger brother. They were treated as mere stones by the roadside. Asha says that she is a royal knight. She should not act based on her feelings. The protagonist says that's right. She is his knight. To disrespect his knight is no different from disrespecting him. Arel emphasizes that he will not accept anyone speaking ill of him or his people. He says he knows that deep down she wants to beat him up too. The protagonist says that the most important thing in all this is that they will be able to show her brother what a great knight his older sister has become. She sighs and asks if he is really serious. When Eret finds out, he starts shouting, saying that there is no way he can beat Lutzen. Arel asks him to calm down and says that a fight between children is nothing serious. Whoever strikes first wins. He just needs to hit Lutzen first. The protagonist puts his hand on Eret's shoulder and says that now he will be honest. Arel says that all this time, Lutzen has been fighting with him. The protagonist asks if he isn't angry about it. Eret says he is a bit upset about it. However, when he thinks about his sister, who has fought so hard for the family, he can't act immaturely, so he tried to let it all go and focus on his skills. Arel says that's an option, but he asks when Eret will be able to get out of this situation. When he studies a lot and graduates, when he trains and becomes stronger, it will be too late. If a person wants to choose their own path, they need to act quickly. If they wait for the best opportunity, they might end up waiting their whole life. The protagonist says this is his chance to show what happens when someone messes with his family. Arel says he might get the worst of it if he starts a fight anyway, but the protagonist tells him to keep in mind that the third prince will take care of him. Eret is amazed by these words. The protagonist smiles. Arel says he will tell him a plan that will guarantee victory, so he should pay attention. A duel might seem like a good thing, but it's too barbaric, even if it's a mutual agreement, committing violence in front of everyone. Of course, it's more fun to watch others fight. Arel says that, leaving the kids aside, the elders are there to watch too. Haya suddenly appears and asks the protagonist what this is all about. He apologizes for not saying anything before, but he needed to teach them a lesson. Haya says she wanted to do that too, but Eret is not good at fencing. Arel asks her to be quiet because she doesn't know anything. What really matters is winning or losing. She asks how that's possible. If it's a duel, what matters is skill. The protagonist says that's not true. What really matters is cunning. Arel says that soon she will understand and asks why she is interested in Eret. She says it's because he is very cute. The protagonist is confused. Haya says that besides being cute, it looks like he will cry when she pinches his cheeks. She asks if he also doesn't feel like pinching them. She says she wants to bite them. She asks if he doesn't feel the same. He is scared, thinking this girl is sinister. She is just like him. He thinks he should stop the duel now because this girl is strange. The judge announces that they will start the duel. He uses his magic and shouts for them to begin. Lutzen advances, shouting for Eret to die. Haya thinks that Lutzen is not a noble, but an animal. Arel speaks to Eret, asking if he is ready. He tells Eret to take half a step back and diagonally to the right. With that, Eret dodges the attack. The fight continues, and Arel keeps commanding Eret's movements during the fight. The protagonist starts giving multiple orders at the same time. Eret follows all of them to the letter, even though he is a bit confused. However, he manages to hit Lutzen, knocking him to the ground. The other students are happy and say that even though he was clumsy, he managed to dodge everything and land his blow. Asha sighs in relief. Arel celebrates, saying that this is what is called proxy training. The protagonist used a communication device that is only used in his territory. He thinks that children only move according to what they learned from books, so it's easy to read their movements. The protagonist shouts that he did a good job and should keep it up. Lutzen gets up angrily and attacks again, shouting that a despicable wretch like him shouldn't dare hit someone. Eret is a bit scared, but Arel asks him to stay calm, Lower his waist and attack now. Eret does so, and an energy comes out of his sword, even scaring Heya. The attack hits the sensitive part of a man, making Lutzen fall to the ground unconscious. The judge stops the duel and says that Eret is the winner. The protagonist says that all glory is fleeting. Gadel says that a defeat is a defeat, so he will accept it. However, this game has gone too far. Arel asks what he is talking about. Gadel says he already expected this, but after he wins, none of this will matter. Eret comes running, happy to have won. Arel tells him he did a great job. Heya runs up to him and says she expected this. She knew he would win. Arel thinks that Heya lies without even blushing. Eret asks if his sister will be okay because he heard that Gadel was the captain of the 13th Order of Knights. The protagonist says that's true, but it doesn't mean anything. He says that Asha will definitely win. Arel grabs Eret and tells him to watch closely because his sister didn't work so hard to become a knight for nothing. Gadel says he won't underestimate her, so he will give it his all. He starts to attack first. He thinks he has never let his guard down. Even if he loses this fight, he will fight harder than anyone else. However, his vision starts to blur, and he wonders what's wrong. Suddenly, he takes a very strong blow to the stomach, which throws him hard against the wall. The wall behind him breaks, and he is left lying on the ground. Asha starts spinning her weapon and says that she also wouldn't let her guard down. That's what she wanted to say, but she ended up overdoing it a bit. She smiles and says that despite Gadel's title, he is extremely weak. Asha sighs again. With everything resolved, she asks Arel to warn her before doing something like this again. He says that thanks to what he did, her younger brother now admires her even more. When he saw the fight, he said he wanted to become as strong as his sister. The protagonist says that thanks to what happened, Eret won't suffer anymore, and he himself will ensure that the Lutzen family doesn't do anything. He says that she not only saw her brother, but also helped him. Arel asks if she isn't happy. Asha smiles and says she should thank him for that. He says now they have to return to the castle. When people face a bad situation, they tend to go into denial, or so they say. The nobles couldn't believe what they heard. They start discussing, saying that, according to the official letter, the lords of Ernesia recruited and trained soldiers for the war, but they were too passive to call that training. The reason for this is that they think the war might not happen. After working hard, if all the supplies and weapons reserved grow old in the warehouse, how problematic would that be? That's why they pointed the finger at Lord Arel, saying he was overreacting. However, he says he was just preparing for the worst-case scenario, and he said this firmly. Regardless, they claimed there was no way a war would break out and continued as before. And the news reaches the capital of the Merman Empire. The Emperor says he has something important to say to everyone today. He asks if they know the person who has been disrupting the continent's finances. He is not only making unfair profits by manufacturing all kinds of strange products, he even sells paper, which is a specialty of the Empire, as he pleases. And this is unforgivable. That demon from the kingdom of Ernesia. For the safety of the continent, together with the allies who agree with this idea, they will use their swords to stop this demon. The king of the Domanial kingdom, the Duke of Dekado, Seyapen. The emperor declares that they will join forces and judge the kingdom of Ernesia. They cross their swords and celebrate. According to the declaration, the following conditions will be notified to the kingdom of Ernesia. If you truly wish to prevent the shedding of innocent blood, show your sincerity. First, the discontinuation of paper production and the total decommissioning of the facility. Second, the sharing of manufacturing methods for products exclusive to the kingdom of Ernesia. Third, returning to each country the profits unfairly obtained through the products. Lastly, sending Prince Arel of Ernesia to the empire to study and share his talent. Theorel tears the paper, furious, and shouts that they were mocking his kingdom. He shouts that he will no longer avoid war. He will show the full strength of his kingdom right now. They will not give up any piece of land that their ancestors conquered and lived on all their lives. At the end of the territory of Ernesia, in the Bayesian fortress, the troops were advancing. Prince Gile asked if the alliance of the three kingdoms had already arrived. He wanted to know what their war squad had reported. The soldier informed that approximately 70,000 soldiers were advancing. Another report arrived, revealing that, in fact, 100,000 soldiers were attacking from the north side. Gile thought that this could not be all. Surely there were more troops coming behind. As the heir to the throne, he knew he had to stop them at all costs. He shouted, saying they had nothing to fear, as their enemies were a disorganized group of people who had hastily united. Not a single ant should enter the castle. The protagonist thought that a large-scale battle had begun, but he did not give the order for any of his soldiers to act. His orders were that they would only fight if the enemies tried to enter. At the moment, everyone in Fahelia was on guard. Arel said he was also busy and brought something in his hand to Reki. As soon as he showed it, It was a giant piece of meat. He said it was the fun time to cook with Arel. Reki was shocked and started salivating at the sight of the food. It was a dish of snow rabbit meat. The two sat down to eat, and Arel commented that he couldn't believe many people didn't eat this because it was rabbit. Reki said it was nonsense, that since they had never starved to the point of eating insects, they fussed over such things. Even Arel was shocked by her comment. They finished eating, and he said everything was very good. The protagonist got up and said that now that it had started, he would try to cook something else. Reki asked what he was going to make. She looked at the table and said, "Flour and dried fruits? This is going to be delicious." Arel replied that he was not finished yet. She commented that, anyway, he was very good at cooking because usually, nobles didn't even go near the kitchen. Arel revealed that all the food from their trading company was created by him. He looked at her and said he had never told anyone, but there was a time when, if everything went wrong, he thought about staying quiet and becoming a cook. She said this was quite unexpected to hear. A few minutes later, everything was ready. The protagonist took it out of the oven and called it Arel's snack. Reki took one and started eating. She was impressed with the taste and commented that she would gain weight if she kept eating like that. Arel said he made it so his troops could eat quickly in a war situation, and that since he might have to eat too, he tried to make something good. Reki replied that he hadn't even received a mobilization order yet, and might not need to. He started laughing and said he was preparing for anything that might happen. Arel said he was doing this out of concern. Meanwhile, chaos was unfolding in the war. The soldiers were fighting bravely while the enemy troops tried to enter the castle at all costs. Giles was shouting, saying they needed to counterattack. He asked if reinforcements had arrived. His soldier replied that there were still no reinforcements and that the enemies were climbing non-stop, so they couldn't attack anyway. Suddenly, another soldier came running, shouting that there was an emergency report from the reconnaissance squad. Giles asked what was happening. The soldier informed that the main force of the enemy army was arriving and had a total of 210,000 soldiers. The horses were running, and many soldiers were advancing fearlessly. Giles began to worry as the enemies were already there. Meanwhile, in the conference room of Ernesia, everything was chaotic. They commented that the number of enemies was rapidly increasing, and that it was only a matter of time before the fortress fell. They suggested it might be better to retreat and reorganize. One person said that the prince's safety was also at stake. Theorel thought for a moment and gave the order for the front line to retreat and inform the citizens of the current situation. Everyone was astonished by this. The king stood up and shouted, saying that they should notify all the nobles and lords who could fight to step forward. Angrily, he declared that this was a national mobilization order. A letter arrived for Arel, and he was surprised because he did not imagine that his brother Giles would fight in the war, as members of the imperial family were not sent to the battlefield. He thought that the time had finally come. The protagonist thought that he had been expecting this because facing 3 against 1 was too much, and there was nothing scarier than facing enemies stronger than you. He stood up and said that if he wanted to live comfortably, his kingdom should remain intact. Arel said that this time there was no way around it. He would have to return to being the god of war he once was. With that, he prepared to go to the battlefield, leaving only a few troops to defend his territory. The protagonist bid farewell to Fly and said that now he would have to work hard to get his food. He was a bit worried about his sister and asked if she could stay in Fahilia. She looked at him and started shouting angrily, saying that she didn't want to stay there, that she would follow him everywhere. How could she stay there knowing that everyone was risking their lives? He thought she was very stubborn. He reflected that her skills would be very useful in the war, not to mention her strength, but he didn't want to put her in danger. He thought that if he said he had no other choice because Kanya wanted to protect the territory, maybe his father would let him get away with it. Kanya held her brother by the shoulder and thanked him for worrying about her, but she couldn't let him fight alone. She said that if her younger brother was going, she should accompany him. He sighed and said that if she put it that way, he wouldn't stop her anymore. The protagonist said it was finally time to give her something. Kanya was surprised and asked what it was. He took out a beautiful sword, handed it to her, and said that Lady Fanelia had entrusted it to him. She asked what her mother did. He replied that this was the famous sword passed down from generation to generation in the Kenchester family. It was known as Keltia, in honor of the first head of the family. It was a high-quality sword that even the dwarves recognized as something hard to come by. Kanya held the sword and asked if she could really accept it. Arel said that she was the 3rd swordmaster to appear in the entire kingdom and should not hesitate to accept it. She looked intently at the sword and said her mother's name. Kanya was radiant and happy. The protagonist began to leave and thought that in moments like this, he should let her enjoy it to the fullest. He climbed onto a small stage and thought that he should make the minimum sacrifices possible, appropriately reward those who fought bravely, and take care of the families of the deceased until the end. To achieve this, he couldn't show his anxiety. He shouted that they would go to the front line according to the order of His Majesty the King. RL said that there were a total of 320,000 enemy soldiers, but he had not trained any soldier to die. He stated that he would protect his territory not through their sacrifice, but through their brave military service. The protagonist said that his army had 23,000 soldiers, and that they would fight together until they returned home victorious. In the Derzia fortress, on the northern front, everything was chaotic. Soldiers were trembling with fear, others were wounded, until Arel arrived with his force. He looked at all of this, and thought that the battle was more intense than he had expected. Arel and Kanya went to their brother Gile and presented themselves. Gile was feeling guilty about all this. He apologized to his brothers for making them come there. He said that if he had controlled his army better, perhaps the outcome would have been different. Arel was surprised by this. He spoke such words even while facing an overwhelming number of enemies. Unlike their mother, Gile seemed to have a good personality. The protagonist said that from what had been passed to him, things didn't look good at all. Gile confirmed that was exactly it. The border fortress had fallen into the enemy's hands, and now belonged to them. 320,000 soldiers were attacking them now. He said that the enemy had stopped the attack to reorganize, but would return tomorrow. The protagonist thinks that things really aren't looking good. If he had taken a few more days to arrive, even this place would have been lost. Gile says he is very happy to know that Arel has 23,000 soldiers, which should be enough to hold out until the other nobles arrive. Arel disagrees with this. He thinks that, in this way, his soldiers would only be used as a shield. He slams the table and tells Gile that they couldn't wait any longer. The protagonist says that they need to stop just defending and start attacking. If they wait any longer, it will be too late. Gile says he understands how Arel is feeling, but in their current situation, it's impossible. The protagonist opens the tent and says he has prepared for moments like this, and asks Gile to take a look. Arel thinks that he had asked the blacksmiths to create this right after he learned about the war. Gile asks if this is what he is thinking. The protagonist says that, first of all, it's a mobile watchtower. He explains that he planned to place archers and mages there, and since it's prefabricated, they could dismantle and transport it to another location. He asserts that this will definitely be useful in the battle, but there's more. Gile is impressed with what he sees. He asks what this weapon is called. Arel says he was thinking of naming it Gate-Blocking Knife Cart. He explains that it's a weapon commonly used in past siege wars, made to defend and push, and it was further strengthened with magic and dwarf technology. The protagonist says they have many of these. All they need to do is assemble them, and in no time, everything will be ready. Arel states that he will take full command related to defense, so Gile can focus solely on counterattacking. Gile smiles. The protagonist thinks that those bastards from the Three Kingdom Alliance thought they could keep attacking non-stop, but now it's time for a counterattack. Meanwhile, at the enemy base, their leader reads a report and says that their reinforcements have arrived. Others comment that, so far, everything has been going well, but now they're facing problems. They ask the leader why he is laughing. He says it's nothing, just that the person leading the reinforcements is quite interesting. Another asks who this person is. The man says it's Arel Ernisia, the one responsible for enriching the kingdom of Ernisia recently, and also the reason for this war. The two shout, asking if he was there. The leader says that when he heard that Arel was a child, and behind all that, he thought it was just a lie, but now he can confirm it personally. He slams the table and asks his companions if they aren't curious too. The man says he shouldn't be saying this now, but his extradition is crucial. The leader says he knows all that, and will keep the agreement in place. He asserts that now they need to prepare to take them down. The next day, everything was ready. Lord Arel's army was prepared, along with their new weapons. The protagonist looks into the distance and comments that the number of enemy soldiers was disgusting. An army of 50,000 men was coming their way. Lord Arel gives the order to his army. The enemy troops comment that Arel's army only knows how to hide behind shields, and that they should attack with everything at once. The enemy leader asserts that they have more than twice as many soldiers, and that no matter how much of a genius Arel is, there's no way he can do anything. Suddenly, a small rain of arrows and some minor spells are launched. Some soldiers are hit, while others manage to protect themselves. Their leader shouts for them to raise their shields and continue. Arel says he expected this. The two armies meet on the battlefield. The enemy soldiers start to notice that something is wrong, because Lord Arel's troops aren't even moving. Their shields are different from the ones the nobles use. Suddenly the troops open up and Arel's knife cart appears. The soldiers are startled and shout to retreat, but it's already too late. They start screaming. The protagonist, with a serious expression, observes this massacre, and thinks they should blame the foolish commander they had. The enemy leader realizes they are losing and shouts to his mages, telling them they must break the battle line now. He thinks it's a waste to use his mages now, but he has no choice. He says that on the battlefield, a knight using aura is stronger than others, but a mage is even more terrifying than an aura knight. The magic of a high-level mage can be a weapon of mass destruction. He thinks that, due to the amount of mana a mage has, he didn't want to use them right now. He shouts again at the mages, telling them not to worry and to use their powers, as it would show that these tricks were nothing compared to superior power. Suddenly, an energy wave passes through them, leaving everyone frightened. The commander asks what they are doing and why they are not using their magic. The mages say they can't activate their magic. Aurel must have done something and hit them with some dispel spell. The leader can't believe it. The enemy commander asks if they also had mages on their side. Reki was already casting her magic. She comments that canceling the enemy mage's magic was incredibly easy, and wonders if they really know magic. The enemy mages keep trying to do something, but Aurel says that now he is a Class 6 mage, and that the mages on the other side wouldn't be able to avoid his eyes with mere Class 4 skills. Their leader shouts, asking if they were really going to do nothing. The mages say that Aurel's mages also wouldn't be able to cast special magic, as after a dispel like this, there is no doubt their mana would be consumed quickly. Reki says everyone should move to the next level. Several lightning bolts begin to fall on the battlefield, striking the enemy army. The leader shouts again at his mages, asking what that was, as they had said that Aurel's mages wouldn't be able to use magic. A mage with a trembling voice says it's impossible, even with a large amount of mana, to use that kind of magic after a dispel spell. He realizes they are using magic gems, and all of them are of the highest quality. The enemy leader is paralyzed, wondering how a mere territorial lord could have such gems. He wonders what kind of person Lord Aurel is. A barrage of magic is launched onto the battlefield, freezing a large portion of the enemies, while another spell is cast, burning the remaining enemies who were screaming for help. The soldiers begin to flee, and by the end of the battle, the enemy army, which had 50,000 soldiers, had 30,000 dead. With the battlefield dominated and destroyed, the protagonist turns his back and starts to leave. As he leaves with a serious expression, he thinks that even winning doesn't make sense. He wonders why they have to kill or die for nothing. He just wanted to leave and have fun. Sena asks what they would do with the troops that fled. The protagonist says to do nothing, just rest while keeping watch. He asks to take the abandoned enemy survivors to captivity. Gilles arrives, smiling at all this, and shouts that it was expected of his brother Lord Aurel, an excellent defense. Gilles says the enemy would never have imagined they would be massacred this way. He emphasizes that Aurel did a good job. The protagonist says he didn't do anything special. The enemies fell into his trap. The one who really dealt with the real problem was Gilles himself. Aurel thinks that perhaps Gilles is a bit confused, but for him to live his comfortable life peacefully, the future King Gilles must accept all the glory of the war. Gilles clenches his fist confidently and says that with this defeat the enemy suffered, their morale must be shaken, so there is no better time to attack them than now. Aurel agrees, saying he is right. He could do as he sees fit. Gilles says that finally the tide is turned in their favor. The protagonist thinks that while his brother rides along the front lines, he can stay with the defense, drinking soda and eating. Aurel wonders how to live peacefully during the war. This is actually quite easy. Just stay on defense and have fun. Gilles, with his troops, immediately launched a counterattack. Thanks to the performance of the Fahilia army, they had some spare time. Thus, they divided the defense force into a third and launched an attack. To counter the numerical superiority of the Three Kingdom Alliance, Gilles and his troops chose a war of attrition and surprise attacks from the sides and rear, rather than a full-scale war. Minimal defense and a complete surprise attack. And, behind the front lines where the fierce battle was taking place, someone was eating. Aurel and his companions were enjoying an incredible feast. He said the meat was so good it melted in the mouth. Kanya commented that it had been a while since they had eaten something so good. The protagonist mentioned that there was also rabbit meat. She responded that she couldn't eat another bite. Asha looked a bit serious about this, while Sena was drinking. She said it was sad to know they were the only ones resting while the others were fighting fiercely. Sena asked what was wrong with that, saying that in war, only the smart survive. Aurel agreed with Sena. Thanks to the mobile watchtower and the knife carts, Lord Aurel's army was seen as slower, but the most dangerous to face. Thus, the protagonist's excuse to stay on the defense worked perfectly. Aurel relaxed a bit, as his brother's counterattacks were successful. The enemy troops were cautious and wouldn't attack again so quickly. He thought that this way, he could enjoy the day to the fullest. The protagonist looked ahead and asked if Reki was okay, saying that maybe they should take her to sleep in a more comfortable place. Arel looked at her and thought that Reki was responsible for half of the dispel spell from yesterday. She played the main role. Clearly, she was exhausted after absorbing and circulating mana in the magic gem. That's why the protagonist asked her to sleep. Reki trembled and said that even if she fainted, she needed to eat. So she went to the table and started eating like crazy. As soon as she finished eating, she slept right there. He smiled and said that it was okay. They should eat, rest, and have fun for now. After all, starting tomorrow, they would be busier than ever. The enemy army leader sees the war report and starts sweating, thinking that this is not good at all. He thinks that the kingdom's army, led by the first prince, is annoying, but he is just at the level of a cute rookie at best. The real problem is Arel. The problem was that the army collapsed due to an unexpected counterattack. The leader wonders if Arel wasn't just a brat who only knew how to do business. The leader can't believe that Arel was able to annihilate 30,000 soldiers from his 50,000-strong army with just 23,000 soldiers. He thinks that fighting a war requires experience to know what's necessary and what to do. It's more important to experience it yourself than just to plan. The leader wonders how a 16-year-old boy could create such a situation. What intrigues the leader most is why the protagonist stays on the defense instead of attacking. With the talent he's shown, Arel could easily win this war. The leader wonders who the hell Reincarnated is. The carriages were on the road. The next day they led the troops to join the unit led by Gil. Together, they would move to reclaim their stolen front fortress. The protagonist was analyzing something. He called a soldier and asked to reduce the speed, wanting them to move at half the current speed. Kanya asked if something was wrong, but Arel said he thought the enemies were waiting for them. The protagonist began to explain and asked if the enemies didn't suffer a great defeat the last time they fought. Kanya said yes. Arel said that they are not idiots and wouldn't do the same thing twice. He pointed to the map and said they would soon pass through that place, which is perfect for an ambush. He said there's no way the enemies would miss such a great opportunity. He smiled and looked at her, saying that if the enemy is putting in so much effort to catch them, it's only fair they fight them head on. The day continues to pass, and the troops keep moving. They arrive at a gorge. The Alliance troops were hidden in the trees above, saying that Arel's army would soon pass through there. They say the surprise attack needs to work no matter what. However, no one passes by. One of the leaders thinks Arel is late, although he had received reports that his advance is slow due to the movement of heavy infantry and towers, but they should have already arrived. He thinks they might have been discovered, but that couldn't be. Suddenly they hear horses and see the carriages. The commander shouts for his soldiers to attack. The attack begins. However, the arrows fired hit a magical barrier. The commander is surprised by this. The mage behind him says they can't cast magic again because they were hit by the dispel spell once more. The commander thinks this is impossible. How did they cast such a spell so quickly? It seems Arel was already prepared for this. He shouts that if they face Lord Arel now, the same thing that happened before will happen again, so they should retreat. They start running, shouting that they should withdraw as quickly as possible. However, a soldier steps into a trap and falls to the ground, screaming in pain. Several others also start falling into traps. Sena appears before them, saying that these traps are used for hunting, but when it comes to capturing people or animals, there is no difference. She leaps, scaring the enemies, and punches one of the soldiers. She says that if they want to start a war, they should be ready for the consequences. The commander draws his sword and says that if she doesn't get out of the way, he will have to use force and won't lose to an enemy knight, especially just a woman. He charges quickly, shouting that she will die. Calmly, Sena begins to gather energy in her hand. Suddenly, a flash and a sound are seen and heard from where they were. Sena and Asha had defeated everyone there, but Sena was too heavy-handed. Arel had told them to respond in kind. They should show how unpleasant they could be. After that, the enemies would avoid facing them out of fear. The protagonist says that instead of this war escalating, they would become people the enemy army would fear just by hearing their names. This is his method. The troops that tried to attack Arel by surprise were completely annihilated, and the Reincarnated border fortress was also successfully reclaimed. After the fortress was retaken, the Alliance army tried several times to attack again, but the morale of the Reincarnated army was very high and would not be easily defeated. Above all, those who fought was Kanya, with her terrifying strength, easily fighting and defeating one soldier after another. The soldiers shouted that someone with that level of strength could not be just a simple princess. It seemed the rumors were true. The soldiers wondered if there was anyone who could fight her, but they said they had concentrated their forces elsewhere, so they couldn't manage that. Kanya continued to massacre all who tried to fight her, and the enemy soldiers screamed for help. And it was after all this that the Alliance army completely lost its morale. Several months have passed since the war began. and it was clear that victory for the kingdom of Ernesia's army was within reach. The current status of the troop that RL commanded was significant: 121 dead, 142 seriously injured, and 192 lightly injured. Unlike the other lords of the kingdom who had lost half their forces, the army controlled by Lord RL showed overwhelming results. At the Alliance command base, a man says that while both sides are facing off in the south, in the northeast they can't break through their defenses. He comments that it is not good for them to keep losing troops like this, and thinks it is better to leave the northeastern front aside for a while. He emphasizes that it is disturbing, but it is time for all of them to make big decisions there. If they are to win the war, the kings would understand. Now is the time to give it their all. But a beautiful day begins. The protagonist was lying down, commenting that after so many attacks from the Alliance, they suddenly went quiet. While he focused on defense, the forces of the other lords could fight freely against the enemies. He says that thanks to this, while the troops on both sides suffered losses, he and his army had almost no deaths. He mentions that the day is too good for people to die. Arel comments that the alliance of the three kingdoms tried to invade out of self-interest and to prevent them from progressing further. On the side of Ernesia, they were also committed to achieving their goals and emerging victorious. As the situation improved, other lords who had been passive encouraged their soldiers to kill more people. Even Gil participated in the war to make a contribution worthy of the throne. All of this was due to greed. Whether with good or bad intentions, in the end, these wars are fought because of greed. Humans are creatures that grow with greed and do not hesitate to do anything to satisfy it. Whether it's money, power, or corpses piling up at their feet, they always try to trample over others. Arel thinks he is not in a position to say much because he is also greedy. But he wonders if these people know this. No matter what you pile up under your feet, in the end, the view of the sky you look at never changes. If you try to be greedy and look up, all that remains in the end is... Suddenly Asha arrives and asks why he's being lazy again. He asks if she can't see how sad he is. She says she won't tell him to act carefree, but there are other soldiers watching, so he should behave decently. The protagonist smiles and tells her that if she let go of dignity, she would live much better, and if she doesn't believe it, she should just try it. Asha responds that she will refuse because she still has a lot of work to do. She says that anyway, everything has been very quiet in the last few days. Arel comments that it seems things have calmed down, as they haven't had any attacks for 6 days. Asha says it would be great if the war ended like this. Arel just looks at her and asks if the Alliance scum changed their minds. He whistles, and Asha asks what he is going to do. Suddenly, the sound of wings flapping is heard. Fly lands in front of him. Asha screams for him to wait, saying it's too dangerous, but he tells her not to worry, that he will be back soon. Asha keeps shouting for him not to do this, but he flies off seriously with Fly. She just watches him move away in the sky. The protagonist continues to advance quickly through the sky. Suddenly, he notices something and says he expected this. He contacts Asha and asks her to talk to Sena, saying he will pass on information about what is to come. He didn't believe the war was already over. He starts explaining and says there is a problem there. He asks what the Alliance's next step is. Sena asks if they are going to attack again. Asha, still frightened, asks the protagonist to stop doing such unexpected actions like the last one. Arel says he won't do that anymore. He asks Sena if the enemies are far enough away not to make another attack. She says she thinks they won't give up. The protagonist agrees and says there's no way they would surrender in the current situation. Then, he asks if they know why. Asha raises her hand and asks if it's because of their pride. Arel says Asha hit the nail on the head and that she will get a cookie for it. He says the war started when the Alliance declared it. Therefore, even if the situation worsens, they will not retreat. Arel says that they criticized the kingdom by inventing various things. They couldn't simply say it was a misunderstanding. If they backed down now, it would worsen public opinion. The protagonist asserts that for this reason, this war wouldn't end now. He asks the two what they could do at this moment. He bangs the table and says that soon, the Alliance would order a general mobilization. Sena asks if that wouldn't be dangerous. Arel responds that it's irrelevant, as the Merman Empire has many slaves and would clearly come back with more troops than now. The protagonist says they managed to push back their main force, but a much larger army might be on its way. He asserts that the enemies would try to fight with quantity, not quality. Arel looks down and begins to smile, releasing a bit of aura, saying he wouldn't let them do as they please. After this conversation, he walks away confidently, thinking that a professional of lives like him would never tremble, even if 1,000,000 soldiers appeared in front of him. Arel says he has prepared something for this kind of occasion, which only he, Aiken, and his father knew about. Sena asks what it is. The protagonist pulls the sheet and reveals a large long-range crossbow, saying it's being taken to the front line for installation. Arel states that this crossbow can fire 100 shots per minute, and the arrows were also made by them. Not even the king's best researchers managed something like this. Sena and Asha are surprised by this weapon. The protagonist sighs and says he based this weapon on modern ones. If he didn't need to, he wouldn't have made something like this, but this time there was no way to avoid it. Since they tried to take what's theirs, they must respond in kind. Night begins to fall. Near the defense line of the Kingdom of Vernesia, the leader of the troops says it's been a while since they reclaimed the fortress, and the enemies haven't done anything yet. How much longer would they continue like this? He says this is the golden opportunity they have. If they attack now, he would get all the credit. He yells for his soldiers to start the attack immediately. Suddenly, he freezes in place. He looks ahead, sweating in fear, and sees a sea of soldiers in front of him. One of the soldiers asks if they should still advance. The leader yells at him, saying there's no way to do anything against that number of people. He screams for everyone to retreat as quickly as possible and send a messenger to the fortress. The enemy troops began to move. The alliance gathered all the force they had and launched an attack on the kingdom's defense line. Giles yells that they can't lose this fortress again. He thinks that the enemy attack has no tactics. They just want to wipe them off the map with numbers. The trumpets are sounded. The troop leader orders the mages to start attacking the troops of the Kingdom of Vernesia. The mages say they can't use magic again due to the same spell. Their leader says he expected this, but doesn't know how they managed to do this so many times. He yells that this was already in his plans. He orders the mages to retreat and all other troops to advance. He tells everyone to attack without fear of killing and dying, as they would retake this fortress. He thinks the number of slave soldiers who could die there is huge, but the important thing is that they managed to win. The leader looks at the troops of the Kingdom of Vernesia and wonders why they aren't retreating, even in the face of all this. Normally, they would retreat inside and preserve the troops. Suddenly, a bolt passes by him. He looks and sees a huge arrow next to him. He wonders where this giant arrow came from and how they managed to shoot from so far, as he had never heard of anything like this. As he looks up, a rain of giant arrows is coming. He wonders if this is even possible. The arrows begin to hit the Alliance's troops, causing a massive massacre. Screams could be heard from afar, and blood begins to spread around the place. The leader screams for them to retreat. Even without knowing what to do, the leader thinks they have a limit on arrows, so this is something temporary. If they endure a little longer, it would work. Suddenly the sound of horses is heard. Giles strikes one of the enemies and leads his cavalry from the front. The Alliance shouts that this was a surprise attack from the start. Meanwhile, from the sky, the protagonist watches all this, saying that if the Alliance keeps advancing, they will die to the crossbows and won't be able to retreat due to the cavalry. He starts to head back and mentions that the enemy commanders must be cursing him right now. The protagonist notes that the crossbows are doing their job well. The enemy army needs to stay on guard to avoid being hit and, as a result, can't move freely. Not even a decent shield can stop these arrows. What could they do now? Arel asks his team how many arrows they still have. They say they have enough and are currently reloading. Arel thinks the crossbows are good, but they have a problem. Because it's a complex device and takes time to reload, they might have to abandon the rapid-fire function. And the most important thing is the arrows. Each one is a special product from his forge. But if they fire too quickly like this, it would become a money-eater. Reki contacts the protagonist and asks if he can hear her. He says yes, and asks if they ran out of magic stones. She replies they still have plenty, but the mages are running out of mana. He asks how many magic stones they can still use. She says about 80%, and the dissipation alone is enough. He says there's no way to ask a 6th-class mage to use her time and power for dissipation. He announces it's the right time. The cavalry is retreating. Now it's her turn. The protagonist gives the order. Burn them all! Reki begins to cast her magic and says that her lord's command is supreme. The enemy soldiers start getting trapped in a kind of curtain. They wonder what's happening. They are trapped there. Reki says that the policy of the Fahelia army is minimal damage to our allies and a devastating blow to the enemies. A great flame falls from the sky, hitting some soldiers. They can't understand how a mana shield was used like that and wonder what happened. The fire keeps burning, and as it extinguishes, the soldiers who were hit simply disappear completely. The other soldiers look at this and start running and screaming desperately. Arel just watches them from above, saying it's better for them to run. The protagonist says they should immediately inform Giles to launch a full attack against the Alliance. The army of the Kingdom of Vernesia continued to announce victory after victory, leading to a situation completely different from the beginning of the war. The ones most displeased with this news were the Emperor of the Merman Empire, who angrily asks what is happening. He talks to the king of the kingdom of Demaniel and the Grand Duke of the Duchy of Sejepen, saying he ordered a general mobilization, sending more troops. However, the Grand Duke says he has nothing to say. The king of the kingdom of Demaniel says there's no point in blaming the Grand Duke now. The important thing is what will happen next. He asks the Grand Duke what he thinks will happen. The Grand Duke asks if he can be honest, and they say yes. He says they are close to being defeated. About half of their troops have already been completely decimated, and the morale of the alliance has plummeted. Even if they attack with everything they have now, they won't be able to resist the weapons of the kingdom of Urnesia. The emperor asks if he is referring to the crossbow that the boy named Arel made. The king of the kingdom of Demaniel says that one of his best craftsmen said that the person who designed that weapon is a monster. They tried everything to make one but failed. The emperor is irritated, as they were superior in numbers and only started the war after analyzing every detail multiple times. He didn't imagine Arel would be such a powerful obstacle. The Grand Duke says the only way they have to try to turn the tide is to buy time and try to find a weak point in the kingdom of Urnesia. Suddenly, someone bursts through the door shouting that they are in trouble. The emperor says that no one is allowed to enter because this is an important meeting. He asks what is so important. The man, trembling, says that the army of the kingdom of Urnesia. Kanya asks if she just needs to destroy what is in front of her. The protagonist confirms and asks her to use everything she has. They were in the kingdom of Demoniel, in front of the border gate. Kanya analyzes the gate in front of her, prepares herself, and jumps with all her might. She breaks through the iron gate with a single blow. The soldiers shout that they need to stop them from entering the fortress. They all advance towards Kanya. She looks at them and asks why they are so slow. With just one blow, she defeats them all at once, throwing them away. She smiles and says that if they are all like this, she can defeat them alone. Arel smiles and says he expected this. When it comes to destroying gates, a master swordsman is the best option. The war between them starts there. The two armies meet. Thiril, full of hatred, shouts that countless lives were sacrificed for the enemy's greed, and now they would pay for everything. Arel continues commanding the attacks, and says that his father was very angry, and that their next target would be the capital of the Three Kingdoms Alliance. In this way, the kingdom of Urnesia not only reclaimed the border in an instant, but also took the enemy's border fortresses. Sena says she can't believe they were able to enter the enemy fortress. Asha says that at the beginning of the war they had to retreat, and now they managed to do this. The protagonist arrives smiling, and says that now the alliance leaders won't be able to stay calm. Asha asks where Kanya is. Suddenly a man kneels, shouting for the second princess. All the soldiers were kneeling before Kanya, amazed by what she did in the war. Besides being a master swordsman at this age, they ask what her secret is. She smiles and says all she did was eat and train a lot. They are amazed by her. Arel says Kanya seems to be busy and doesn't seem to be hating all the attention. Asha asks what their next plan is, and if they will really advance towards the enemy country. Arel says that their advance speed will slow down, but they will continue advancing. He says that as they dominate enemy territory, he will put pressure on the enemy leaders, as intimidating people is his specialty. The protagonist says that in 2 years, they will take 20% of their territory, and in 5 years, they will no longer be able to resist. Asha asks if this means the alliance will collapse after 5 years. Arel says yes. To be more exact, most of the population in the enemy countries will die of hunger after 3 years. The finances of the Three Kingdoms Alliance will be severely damaged as they become the dominant force in trade. The alliance will gradually become isolated. A greater fear than military pressure is economic collapse. If poverty continues, a civil war will probably break out, and they will fight against the army of the kingdom of Urnesia from the outside and among themselves from the inside. Asha says she now feels sorry for them. Arel says Asha is right, it is very sad, and he doesn't want that for anyone. However, they shouldn't forget that the enemies wanted to do exactly that to them. They should be prepared to suffer the consequences when they tried to invade the kingdom of Urnesia. If they weren't prepared for this, they shouldn't have started a war. The protagonist says they shouldn't feel sorry for them, as this is what they asked for. Arel says that unless the alliance drops their swords first, they will retaliate completely and set a precedent. At least that's what his father said, because he is very angry. Sena says that war is a scary thing. Asha agrees with her. The protagonist asks the two not to worry, as this is only in the assumption that the alliance enters a state of siege. If they are smart, they will try to avoid this future at all costs. All they need to do now is wait for the news. Meanwhile, the emperor, angry, shouts that surrendering is unacceptable. He says that in the history of their empire, they have never surrendered like this. One of the emperor's men goes up to him and says that their situation has worsened even more. Unless they withdraw their army, something worse could happen. The emperor trembles with rage, shouting that this is absurd, and asks the man if he has no shame. The man lowers his head and says that if the war continues like this, instead of staining the proud history of their ancestors, they would feel even more shame seeing their people starving and falling victim to the enemy's sword. The man shouts that they have already lost the war. He begs the emperor to declare the end of the war so that their people don't suffer even more. The emperor sighs while the man continues to plead. He says his answer will not change. They will not surrender. The man shouts, asking why all of this is happening. The emperor closes his eyes and says he understands that the man is shouting at him out of concern for the people, and that is understandable. However, they will not surrender. The emperor asks if they thought the situation would improve if they did so, and the answer is no. He says that from the moment they surrender, no one would know what they would do. The emperor says he was the one who declared the war. If the outcome is the same, whether they surrender or not, they only have one choice. The man shouts again, begging for everything to end, or the entire empire will fall. He says the alliance of the three kingdoms will fight to the end of their strength. In the end, the alliance chose not to surrender, but to fight to the end with everything they had. Aurel looks at this and says he didn't think the alliance was this foolish. He had his doubts, but that was the answer they gave. He says he was planning to make arrangements so that people wouldn't starve. There is no way the alliance can win after losing so many troops. Aurel turns around irritated and sighs, saying they asked for this. It's no longer worth watching, and so the final operation of the alliance failed again. They lost the will to fight due to the great crossbow and the brutal magic. When morale drops due to so many defeats, a man runs in to speak with the emperor, saying that a letter from the kingdom of Urnesia has arrived. The emperor begins to read the letter, which says, "Hear me, alliance of the three kingdoms. There is no more reason to shed blood, so surrender quickly. If you show your willingness to surrender, I will help end the war." The emperor trembles with rage. A few days later in the kingdom of Urnesia, Theorel receives a letter. Upon reading it, he says that the alliance has finally surrendered to them. Aurel receives the letter and starts laughing. He begins to jump and kneels on the ground, shouting very loudly. He starts crying, saying that the war is finally over and he will be able to go home. He remembered when he was discharged from the army in his first life and can finally say goodbye to the soldiers. He starts shouting loudly, saying goodbye to the cursed alliance. He says it was horrible fighting against them and hopes never to see them again. Asha scolds him, saying he is making too much noise. While some territorial lord units remained at the front line, the unit of the protagonist and Kanya was called back to the castle. In this way, he managed to return to his land. As soon as he arrives, he opens his arms happily and says he missed this cold. However, he will have to ask people to clear the accumulated snow. He smiles a lot, saying he can finally return to his sweet and peaceful daily life. Meanwhile, at the royal palace, Theorel was resolving post-war matters. He says that with that, they concluded the post-war treatment of the three kingdoms. Next, he would address the contributions of those who protected each border. He says they will reward the Margraves with gold coins and allow them to keep some of the prisoners as slaves. Regarding Aurel, people start saying that the third prince greatly helped in the great victory and deserves to be rewarded. One of them stands up and says he doesn't want to seem rude, but asks if the king plans to keep the great crossbow in the third prince's territory. He says he doesn't want to question, but the power of that weapon is not something a territory can withstand. The others agree. Theorel gets a bit irritated and wonders why they keep doing this. The king says that the crossbows will be carefully managed by the royal palace. Lord Aurel himself said he did not want to take them to his territory. However, the focus here is to discuss what reward should be given to him. The king says he would like to name him Duke. The people at the table agree with this. The king says he asked Aurel what he wanted, but it was something unexpected. He asked for the barren and worthless land around his territory. The protagonist receives this response and starts laughing. He says that's it. There was no reason not to give him those lands. The protagonist says he has had his eye on them for a long time and now finally got them. He says the other nobles will laugh at him for asking for something so worthless, but they can laugh all they want. Aurel calls Reki and says the weather is too dry and asks her to adjust it for him. He stands up and says he will check what he has gained this time. He sees that he received some gold, but he already had plenty, so it wasn't important. Therefore, he will use all this gold reward for his army's fund and to console the families who lost someone. He also receives some slaves, but he thinks that this is not a reward. They just wanted to send them somewhere. The prisoners not taken by the alliance received formal procedures and became slaves of the kingdom of Urnesia. While everyone was thinking about where to place so many slaves, Aurel was happy to receive them, as his territory still had many empty places. Besides money to feed the slaves, all he needed to do was build shelters for them. Thus, it was decided that the protagonist would take half of all the war slaves. In the end, the protagonist sits on his sofa and says the war was tough, but now they have everything they need. He says that now, he can see his grand vision coming to fruition. The protagonist smiles and asks the damned nobles who despise him to just wait. Meanwhile, the king of the kingdom of Demaniel is angry because the kingdom of Ernesia wants 2 million in gold as war reparations. He is desperate because this is not something they could collect in a short period. For them to pay this, the kingdom of Demaniel would have to go through hardships for years, and it would take decades to recover. The king thinks there is no other way out. Elgizen and his companion kneel before the king, trembling and crying, shouting that it is all their fault. Their ignorance brought the worst consequences. The king asks them to stand up and create a future budget plan. Elgizen hesitates, expecting his punishment. The king says it is not that he doesn't want to punish him, but doing so now could cause disturbances in state affairs. The king says that all the nobles who supported the war will not receive any assistance until the compensations are completed. Elgizen stands up and agrees with this. The king says they now need to discuss what they will do next. The Grand Duke receives a letter and reads it, saying they are in trouble. He says the king is trying to make the war his fault and wants him to handle everything alone. One of his men says this is impossible. The Grand Duke replies that he expected this because they are a vassal state. However, he is still glad it ended this way. He says the problem now is the compensation. 800,000 in gold and 40,000 slaves. He says hard times are coming. One of the men there thinks that the Grand Duke, who was considered a war hero, has suddenly become a debtor. He wonders what is happening with Ernesia. Meanwhile, in the Empire, people are starting a rebellion, shouting that the Emperor sacrificed the imperial people by declaring late that they would surrender. The entire war happened because of the Emperor. The people shout that he is a murderer. One of the Emperor's men tries to support him, saying that this bunch of bastards doesn't know what they are talking about. The Emperor says he expected this after sending the letter. He looks out the window and says that he is responsible for all of this. The blame is entirely his. Soon after all this, the Emperor abdicated the throne due to health reasons, and his eldest son inherited the throne. Because of this war, it seemed that time was what the entire alliance of the three kingdoms needed. Someone calls the princess, saying they needed to hurry. Kanya remembers her past, wondering if living as she should is a happy life. She thought all of this was frustrating. However, she ran happily when she was little, while her nanny told her to stop, because it was dangerous to run like that. She was forced to study. People told her that she was the second princess and needed to learn dignity according to her position. She thought that she didn't hate studying, but rather the dignity imposed on the royal family. She thinks that being a princess is undeniable, but what does that have to do with living according to the standards set by them? She began to train. Her nannies watched her and said she was extremely focused on learning swordsmanship. She holds the sword high and lies on the ground, thinking that it would be great if her life were as free as that sword. She thinks that she may have been born as a member of the royal family, but that was when her long-standing desire began. In the present day, she receives a letter. The protagonist comes close to her and asks if they wanted her to return to the royal palace. She says yes. She says her mother and father sent the letters. Aurel says that with the enormous strength she has, she stood out too much in the war. He thinks that all the nobles of the kingdom knew that Kanya had reached the level of a master swordsman, but the image of a princess with a sword was not something so easy to believe, so everyone ignored it. However, with the war, everyone saw her real strength, and that is undeniable. From what the protagonist heard, they say that her power is too great to be confined to just a border territory. The cowardly nobles, because of her power, began to fear her. Aurel tells her that the power of a master swordsman is not easily dismissed. She asks him if he also wants her to return. He looks at her and says he will be honest with her. He says she followed him because she didn't want to live with her predetermined future. He asks her if she knows that she couldn't continue like this for the rest of her life. Aurel says she was able to learn a lot from him and became very strong. However, if she continues by his side, she won't be able to grow more than this. He asks if she doesn't want to return now and create her own environment, whether by recruiting other knights or doing anything else, because her goal is to be recognized so she can become independent from everyone and become a proper adult. She looks at him and says that hearing these things from someone lazy like him is not convincing at all. He says that, in any case, if she wants to truly become a knight, she needs to prove her qualifications. The protagonist asks her to think very carefully about this matter. She leaves the room and begins to walk through the palace. The maids look at a picture of a man and say they are envious because marrying such a handsome man must be very nice. Kanya stands up and grabs the picture angrily, thinking that this trash is now blocking her path. She tears up the picture, leaving the two maids scared. She thinks that arranging a marriage is such a natural thing to do since she is a princess and an adult. She starts to leave and thinks she shouldn't complain. She thinks that they said Arel would also be sent to another territory. His situation is even worse than hers, so she should comfort him. Suddenly she hears a noise. The room was soundproof, but Kanya was on another level so she could hear. She thinks that this shout is of joy. The way he handles things is definitely different from hers. She remembers that when the protagonist was younger, he promised that his life goal would be to have an isolated property and live luxuriously. She realizes that he wasn't joking. She thinks that he is considering being sent to another territory as an opportunity instead of just accepting the fate given to him. He tried to create his own destiny. She wonders if she will be able to do like him. She thinks that if she follows Errol, maybe she can learn and succeed too. The wind blows against the window. While she was lying down, she thinks she forgot the reason she came here. The truth is that she can't continue like this. She can't be a pathetic sister who relies on her younger brother's abilities. Inside his room, the protagonist says that the day is beautiful. A day like this deserves a mandatory rest. Suddenly, someone bursts through the door shouting his name. It's Kanya, who appears smiling and happy, saying she decided to return to the royal palace. He cries and says that it's definitely the best decision. And so, Princess Kanya returned to the royal palace to be truly recognized. Arel bids her farewell, not very happily. He thinks it's a secret, but he had already prepared several things so she could be recognized, but she had already chosen. She says that besides her, there were two other sword masters in the kingdom. First, she should try to defeat them. The protagonist says that now she can't destroy everything during training because, from now on, she will have to pay for what she breaks. She says she will be careful. He looks at her and thinks it's sad that they have to part, but he hopes she finds her path safely. He thinks she won't be too far from him, so she will be fine. He is always rooting for her. After the farewell, he sits in his chair and says it's time to get back to work. He looks at the reports and says that Fahelia is at peace again, and that's good. He sees that the young man from the village got married, which is good news. He says he will find a partner for Fly, too. Arel looks at all this and thinks he has managed to accumulate a lot of money and territory. Maybe it's time to get involved in the financial industry. He says he still has no interest in power and politics, but whoever controls the money controls the whole world. In a civilized society, money is the most powerful weapon. Considering his future plans, he needs to increase his influence. He thinks it's time to create a bank and start monetary reform. Currently, most countries mainly use gold, silver, and copper coins. Thus, prices and types vary from country to country. In such an unstable situation, monetary reform will be of great help. He thinks that even if he does nothing, someone would start this sooner or later. So the protagonist decides to start bringing all this under his control. Arel thinks that if he takes control of the financial sector and strengthens his power with money, there will be no one who dares to look down on and attack them again, like the idiots from this last war. The protagonist thinks he needs to find someone to work for him, and also specialists who can stand out, because his ultimate goal is to hand over the work to someone he can trust and enjoy his life peacefully, without doing anything. He smiles, thinking that this is a great plan. Now he just needs to choose to whom he will entrust the work. Suddenly, Arel receives a call from his mother. As soon as he answers, she asks if he is okay. He says everything is fine and asks why she is calling so late. She says it's nothing major, and mentions that he is already 16 years old. This frightens him because he already knows what she's going to say. She asks if it isn't time for him to start looking for his bride, which scares him even more. His companions congratulate him, but he sits sadly in his chair, thinking about what his mother said. She told him to return to the palace soon to meet the candidates, saying she and the king had chosen the best possible candidates. He is a bit worried about this because he says he is still too young to think about something like that. Arel thinks he didn't know how Kanya felt, but now he understands. Asha asks what his bride is like. He says he doesn't know, but it must have already been decided. However, out of respect for his wishes, the king and his mother would let him choose from the top 10. He hands the papers to the three and says that's why he called them all there. He asks if they could help him with this. The protagonist thinks that this time he can only choose by looking at the papers, so he can't really know what the people want. Maybe he needs to ask for help from someone else. The three say they are not sure what to choose. Arel is astonished by this and asks Asha if she isn't also a noble. She responds that whenever it involved marriage, it was cancelled immediately because of her family's decline. He asks Sena what it was like for her. She replies that when they liked someone, they would just go get them. The protagonist finds this very scary and unhelpful. He decides to ask Reki. She says she has no experience, but thinks he needs to find someone good in culture, martial arts, family, and all other things. He shouts that if he looks for someone like that, he will be alone for the rest of his life. He joins the three and says there is no other choice but to choose together. Sena picks someone, but the protagonist rejects her. They choose another, but the protagonist rejects her again. Time passes and night falls. The next day, the protagonist returns to his mother's house. He hands her the paper. His mother is happy and smiles upon knowing he liked someone. After much deliberation and thoughts, he managed to find a suitable partner for marriage. He thinks his mother is very excited, but he only chose the daughter of a quiet family that doesn't cause problems for anyone. Levana stands up and says that his father was very happy to see his son excited about the marriage. Arel thinks he should never tell his father that he doesn't want to get engaged. They go to the meeting place. As soon as they enter, a man greets him and introduces himself as Count Tuin Coenst. His daughter also introduces herself, saying her name is Saria Coenst and that she is the second daughter of the Coenst family. Arel thinks her family has a territory in the southwestern part of the kingdom. Although they are not wealthy, they have a long tradition and a good reputation. He introduces himself as Arel Ernisia. He invites her to talk a bit in private. The two sit down, and the protagonist looks at her, thinking she is beautiful on the outside and gentle on the inside. He feels she is a true model of nobility. He asks her what she likes to do. She says she loves reading. He thinks he expected this. She isn't the one. She has a wise personality, is kind and polite. She seems to have a deep knowledge of academics. She is a perfect engagement partner. He thinks her personality does not match his. He feels she is so beautiful and perfect that she might be scared of what he does. He asks if they could stop there. She agrees and says she had an excellent time today. Later in the garden, the protagonist and his mother are at the table. He thinks his mother and father liked that young woman a lot. He wonders what to do because if he doesn't marry, his mother could be in a difficult position. His mother sips her tea and asks if he didn't like Saria. He even chokes on his cookie. The protagonist tries to avoid the subject, but his mother says it's no problem because they respect his opinion. The king himself said he would listen to his opinion. Otherwise, there would be no point in doing this. Arel thinks his father may have learned from Kanya that forcing them to marry would only cause incidents. He says that if this is the case, he will refuse this time. He leaves a bit angrily, saying he barely managed. Arel thinks that at the moment, he would like to put aside marriage and just live. There were many things he still hadn't done, for example, the coca. He says that before marrying, he needs to develop the coca. Suddenly he notices that something is watching him. This thing jumps out from behind the bushes and grabs his face. He catches it in his hand and thinks it's a salamander. The protagonist asks why the fire spirit is in the palace garden. He thinks about it a bit and deduces that if it's there, it must be some summoner. However, he wonders if there is such a strong summoner in their kingdom. Suddenly, two people appear in front of him, and a woman asks if he could return the salamander. He looks at her and asks who she is. Suddenly, he remembers that she is Pina Amret Janil. When the war ended, she went to study abroad. She is actually the princess of the Triao Empire, who came there as a hostage. He thinks he knew this from documents. He never imagined he would meet her like this, and thinks she doesn't know who he really is. He asks if the lizard is hers. She says yes, and introduces herself as Peña, so he can call her Your Highness or Miss Peña. The protagonist thinks that for a princess, her response is relaxed. She takes the salamander and says that they are not in the Empire, so it is wrong to force people to follow any formalities. Arel thinks she says this so casually and enjoys it. She turns around and thanks him for catching the salamander. The protagonist is a little disappointed because he wanted to ask her a few more things. As she walks away, he asks her to wait and asks if that lizard is a spirit. She trembles all over and turns, shouting that she doesn't know what he's talking about because that was just a common pet lizard. The protagonist says she doesn't know how to lie. She lifts it up and says it's just a normal pet. Arel claps and says that today's lizards can breathe fire. She covers his mouth and jumps on top of him on the ground. She says she doesn't know who he is, but shouts for him to forget everything he saw there, that she would reward him. The protagonist wonders what is wrong with her. He thinks this is the first time he's seen a lady try to bribe him. Arel says he won't tell anyone because that would be a problem. She asks if he will really keep it a secret. He responds that even if he spread the information, he wouldn't gain anything. Besides, it wouldn't be good for her to pretend ignorance, even if he caused a commotion. He stands up and shouts at her, saying that if she didn't want to be caught, she shouldn't have summoned the salamander. She replies that it's not something she can control because it comes out when it wants. The protagonist thinks that makes sense since the relationship with the spirit is not based on authority, but rather on mutual consultation between the two. Although Pena doesn't seem to be a proper spiritualist, the salamander still follows her because of her high affinity. He says he will teach her a special tip, surprising her greatly. Aurel says it's like training a puppy. She needs to give clear commands. He shows her how it should be. She thinks it's not a puppy but makes some sense. She extends her hand and says he is a good boy and asks him to give his hand. The salamander looks at her and then takes her hand. She is impressed by this. She stands up and commands the salamander to roll. The salamander starts to roll. She asks him to stand up and jump. After that, she asks him to shrink and climb onto her hand. The protagonist says it's quite easy. Pena turns to him and says it's all thanks to him and asks how he knew. He responds that he read it in some books. She runs up to him, delighted, thanking him. Pena asks for his name. The protagonist asks why she's only asking that now. He stands up and says his name is Aurel Ernisia. She falls silent and asks if he really is Ernisia. The protagonist considers giving her a nickname, but that wouldn't be good. Now he just wants to see how she will react to this because the person who made her a hostage is right in front of her. She asks if he was a member of the royal family. This shocks him because he was expecting a different reaction. Aurel asks if nothing comes to her mind when she hears his name. She pauses to think a little and says that he has an unusual name. The protagonist is shocked by this. He thinks she really doesn't know who he is, a member of the royal family who isn't interested in politics. That's what she is. She asks if he knows a lot about spirits. He says he knows a few things. Pena asks if she could ask some questions about it later. He says that's fine with him since he won't be staying in the kingdom. She makes a sad face and asks if they sent him to the countryside. Aurel gets irritated by this, thinking he expected this from a member of the royal family. She thought she could see his situation at a glance. He turns and says that if she wants to contact him, she can just ask the people at the concubine's palace and they will help. She says goodbye and thanks him, saying she will remember that. As he walks, he thinks that although he told her that, they probably won't meet again. He hopes she forgets and doesn't look for him. Well, that's what he thought at the time. Even though it had been a long time since the war ended, his traces were not easily erased. The smell of the dead was still fresh. A man walking by said that smell was sweet. He begins to accumulate magic. He was absorbing the bad energies of the dead, like fear, resentment, anger, and hatred. As he absorbs this, he thinks he was very lucky because he didn't imagine that a tragedy like that would happen. He says he should thank the idiot who started the war. He continues to accumulate this energy and says he only needs a little more time. It wouldn't be long before his day came. Meanwhile, the protagonist is relaxing and thinking he managed to postpone the marriage talk, so he could focus on opening his bank. He teleports along with Reki and Asha, saying that it is a good place. They start walking toward the door. The patriarch of the family opens the door and welcomes them. This man is named Hazel Carrot. After greeting Aurel, he turns to Asha and takes her hand, saying she must be Miss Pernil. He says his youngest daughter talked a lot about her. She introduces herself, saying her name is Asha Pernil. The protagonist looks at the two, thinking this is the Carrot territory. He went there personally to handle a very important matter. Hazel's daughter is named Hea, and she is dating Eret, Asha's younger brother, and apparently they are getting along very well. Hazel invites everyone inside, saying he will show them around. As soon as they arrive in the room, Aurel says he would like to speak directly. He says he is thinking of doing business with the Carrot family. Hazel is a little confused and asks what kind of business, as the protagonist already has several stores. Aurel says it's not something so simple. The scale of this business would be much larger. He taps the table and says he intends to open a bank under his influence in the kingdom of Ernisia. The protagonist emphasizes that they would mint coins and had already informed the king. Aurel throws 3 coins on the table and says those would be the coins that would circulate in the kingdom. He says today's coins have many flaws that make counterfeiting easy, but these he is showing are complex, made by the dwarves, meaning no one would be able to counterfeit something like this. The protagonist mentions that the dwarves were angry with him for using such advanced techniques on mere coins. Hazel says he understands Aurel's intentions, but asks why the protagonist chose him. Aurel asks why it couldn't be him. The protagonist emphasizes that he is not capable of running a bank alone. That's why he came there to find talented people he can work with. Aurel approaches Hazel and says he wants him to be the head of his bank, the president. Hazel asks if he is really sure about this. The protagonist says that, to be honest, he can't handle everything alone, which is why he needs someone like Hazel. Aurel thinks that he could actually do it all by himself, but it would be extremely laborious to manage the money circulating throughout the continent. The protagonist assures that the Carrot family would be very well compensated for this. Hazel ponders for a moment. Aurel observes this and thinks that Hazel is indecisive about something, but the protagonist already expected this. This is why Aurel likes him so much. He is not blinded by greed. The protagonist thinks that Hazel has a good personality, and a good understanding, having accumulated a considerable fortune by investing in the right places. Hazel says there are many variables about this, and asks if Errol thinks everything would go as planned. The protagonist says that Hazel doesn't need to worry, because he will make it happen, no matter what. Arl asks Hazel if he is worried whether the currency could be adequately established within the kingdom. Hazel says yes. The protagonist says there will be several merchants who will oppose it, but it is not impossible. Arl approaches Hazel and asks who he thinks has the most gold coins in the kingdom right now. The protagonist says he has already spoken to the largest establishments and emphasizes that he doesn't just want to reform the currency, but also completely solidify the kingdom's economic situation. Arl asks what Hazel thinks about this, believing he has answered his question, and asks if he would join him. Hazel says the protagonist's plan will certainly be a success and that his wealth must be enormous. Hazel asks why the protagonist wants to get involved with banking now. He emphasizes that if it's just for interest, he would refuse the proposal. Arel says that this is a valid and important question, and he will explain the reason for everything. The protagonist says that, for him, the bank is just a means to control the flow of money, and that it's all for the enormous city that will be built in Fahelia. Arel says he will transform his land, which the nobles look at as trash, into a true paradise. Hazel asks if the protagonist really plans to build a city. Arel responds that building a city is not easy. Even if the kingdom took it on, it would still need detailed preparation. And when you think of it that way, banks are one of the fundamental pieces for the construction of a city. Hazel agrees, saying that the bank is one of the pillars of a city, and asks the protagonist if that is his dream. Arel asks if he understands. Hazel says that a city in Fahelia is unusual, and that other nobles would laugh at it, but it moves him deeply because it is a noble and realistic goal. The two make a deal. Hazel says he will accept his proposal. The protagonist says he has made a great choice, and since they are in agreement, they can discuss it further now. As the protagonist leaves, Hazel asks what he plans to do about the bank's costs once it opens, saying that people will be watching that. The protagonist tells him not to worry because sooner or later everyone will be there to negotiate. Arel thinks they should first resolve their situation. At the southern edge of the kingdom, near the mountain range's border, lies Sena's hometown, a mercenary village called Nachapunil. They went there. The reason they went personally is Sena says they are in a strange position and therefore cannot accept any commission. Arel asks if they were rejected. She apologizes and says that even though he trusts her, the protagonist decides to go there personally. He says that people can't give up just because they were rejected once. The protagonist's goal is to hire all of them as personal security for the bank. If it was difficult for Sena, then he would have to resolve it personally. Suddenly, Reki asks Arel to stay behind her for a moment. She starts using her magic and strikes her staff on the ground, causing a small explosion of energy. Some people who were hiding nearby feel great pain and fall to the ground. Sena is scared. The protagonist notices this and says she seems to know who they are. She says they are people from her hometown, but there must be some misunderstanding. She apologizes and asks him to wait a moment. She goes to the fallen men and angrily kicks one of them. They start arguing, and she kicks him again. Reki asks the protagonist what language they were speaking. Arel responds that they are from another continent, so that must be their original language. He says it's quite difficult to understand. After a brief argument, she comes back and says they can proceed now. When they arrive at the village, he goes to speak directly with the village chief, named Abena Garel. He apologizes for the previous incident. Sena looks at him and calls him grandfather, saying he has gained a lot of weight. He looks at her and asks how she dares to say that to his face. The protagonist notices that they share the same surname and realizes they are. Both respond affirmatively. The village chief says Sena is his granddaughter. He apologizes and asks Arel to excuse his granddaughter for her lack of manners. The protagonist says it's no problem. Abena apologizes but explains that they cannot accept any commission, and if he came there to make the same offer, it would be difficult. He says he won't change his answer and asks the protagonist to return. Arel thinks he is quite inflexible. Reki tells the protagonist that she expected this, as the atmosphere there had changed a lot since before. He asks if she knows something. She responds that when she fled the magic tower and got lost, she passed through there and stayed for a while. Arel asks how it was. She says that compared to that time, the current atmosphere seems a bit strange. She comments that they seem too worried about the surroundings of the village. The protagonist asks if something is happening with the village and offers to help. He asks if the chief could explain a bit more about it. Abena responds that he cannot trouble a noble of the royal family with this, and even if he told him, the protagonist wouldn't be able to resolve it. Arel says he doesn't care about his words. He should just explain what's happening, and he will decide what to do. Abena asks if the protagonist knows about the undead. The protagonist asks what he is talking about. He explains that recently the undead have been appearing frequently near the border. Abena says there are already more than 1,000 of them. Arel is shocked by this. Abena asks if he really didn't know about it. Arel gets irritated, as something was happening there, and 1,000 undead appeared. But instead of discussing it at the kingdom's conference, everyone remained silent. The protagonist asks who is the lord of those lands. Abena says the lord changed recently. He is the cousin of the former lord, Count Kweti Lube. Arel asks why he stayed silent about this matter. Abena says the reason is that only that village was affected. The protagonist asks what he wants to do. Abena responds that it's not something interesting, but a few years ago, Quetel said he needed to hold a banquet but didn't have money, so he raised the taxes. His steward warned that a village was having a poor harvest and was struggling to pay the taxes. Quetil got angry, asking if this was a joke, and said it insulted him. He gave the order that if they didn't pay the taxes, they should eliminate all the useless people. Arel gets irritated and says that Quetel was a sick person. Abena explains that the person who faced the disaster at that time was his son, Sena's father. As soon as he heard the story, he strongly opposed it, saving the village from being completely annihilated. Abena says that Quetil accused his son of a crime and interrogated him, resulting in his son's death. Quetil also had to pay the price 2 years ago when all this was discovered. The protagonist asks how things are going now that Quetil's cousin has taken control. Arel thinks that Quetil's cousin is bearing the family's grudges and pretending not to notice the undead infestation. The protagonist asks Abena if he would accept the proposal if he resolved the problem. However, Abena interrupts him and says there is no need because they were planning to leave that place. This confuses the protagonist. Abena explains that his tribe has moved from village to village for many years, so it wouldn't be a problem. He says that the current lord is one of the problems, but the main problem is the undead outbreak. Abena says that, as mercenaries, they protested and endured as much as they could, but they can't continue like this anymore. They can't take it anymore. Arel asks if he was thinking of leaving the country. The protagonist says he understands the situation, but it would be difficult for other countries to accept them now. Even the nomadic peoples who wandered in the past are now part of a country. Abena agrees, but says they have no other choice. Arel responds that if they moved now, it would only bring new conflicts. He asks what Abena would do if he resolved the problem of the undead. Abena is confused and says there are 1,000 of them, asking why the protagonist would go so far for them. Arel says he has his own reasons, so Abena shouldn't worry about it. He just needs everyone's cooperation. He asks the village chief to carefully consider what he thinks is best, because even if they moved, there would be no guarantee of a stable life. The protagonist says that after solving the undead problem, he is still willing to hire their services for a fair price. Abena thinks about it, and asks the protagonist for some time to consider it. With that, the protagonist goes to see the village with Sena. They watch the children playing. The protagonist asks if the ambush was due to fear of the undead. Sena responds yes, and mentions that they said a foreigner who recently entered the village turned into an undead. As he watches the children, the protagonist thinks that most of the residents there have a fighting power equal to that of an active knight, imagining how much the people have suffered to reach this point. Suddenly, he notices something on one of the boys' swords. He thinks that blue light is from a lineage naturally prone to awakening auras. The protagonist thinks it's a waste to leave them under the control of a foolish lord. If he persuades everyone there, he could put them to good use. Sena looks at him admiringly, thinking he is truly a kind person. After a long time, the village chief accepts the proposal, but if the undead problem isn't resolved, they will leave. The protagonist runs off and says that if he doesn't solve this, he can't call himself a professional as he was in his past lives. They encounter the undead, and Sena takes them down with a punch. She comments that there are many undead wandering through the forest, and since there are many wild animals there, they ended up staying around. The protagonist says the village has had a bit of luck. They continue searching. Arel looks at the undead and wonders where so many are coming from, because observing their behavior, it seems there is no mage controlling them. He thinks that maybe the mage did this just for fun and then left. But what kind of mage would do such a thing? Sena asks if they will get rid of them one by one until none are left. The protagonist says no because that would be very inefficient. There is a better way. He says he will gather them all in one place and burn them at once. Sena asks how they will do that, while Reki comments that the protagonist is extremely cool. He thinks the most effective way is to use holy water from the sacred kingdom, but that water is extremely expensive, not to mention hard to find. He asks if they have a class 6 mage with them, and Reki happily responds that they do. He just asks them to wait. Then he says now comes the most important part, which is how to gather all the undead. After talking, night falls, and Arel and Sena are sitting together. As he drinks tea, Sena just warms herself. He thinks they will cast the most appetizing bait. Arel points to the sky and says there is a falling star. Sena says she doesn't know if she is doing it right. He responds that this is the best method. He explains that the undead live only by instincts and are attracted to humans. If they find fresh human flesh in the forest, they will run to get it. Sena comments that if it's just to be bait, there was no reason for him to be there with her, as it's dangerous. He says it can't be helped. He needs to do this. Arel says that even if Abena didn't say it, he harbors resentment against the nobles, so the protagonist needs to make him trust him. The protagonist asks Sena what she intended to do if her family's people left the kingdom. He says she would follow them, but she just laughs. Arel thinks that given Sena's personality, she would never abandon the people of her hometown. She would probably retire and follow them. He tells her that no matter which path she chooses, he won't stop her. But he doesn't want to lose a talent like her, so it's worth taking this risk. She is happy with this. Suddenly they start hearing footsteps. The undead were coming. The protagonist says they have finally arrived. He extends his hand to Sena and asks if she is ready. She holds his hand and says yes. He climbs onto her back and shouts for her to run. The undead begin to follow them. Sena keeps running and dodging them all. The protagonist thinks this is really dangerous and can't believe the undead are running. He wonders if this is some kind of horror movie. He smiles and says it's like a game of tag. She says it's not the time to enjoy it. He asks if there are already many of them and gives the order for Reki to handle the rest. Reki understands and starts conjuring her magic. She accumulates fire around her and uses her magic wall of fire. A giant flame hits the undead. The flame is so large that it catches the attention of other nearby undead. The protagonist comments that the smell is awful, but wonders if they had no resistance to magic since they died all at once. He wonders if the one who released them hasn't finished the experiment yet. Suddenly, he notices that the magic attracted more undead, and many of them were appearing there. They start chasing the protagonist. He says they will repeat this a few more times, and warns Sena that she will have to run until morning. She just smiles. The night passes and the day breaks. Sena takes a deep breath and lies down on the ground, exhausted. Arel looks at the two of them and says they did very well. He looks back and sees the bodies burning, thinking they took care of everything. Arel asks Reki if there was anyone else besides the undead. She says she couldn't sense any mana nearby. The protagonist looks at the remaining undead and thinks he can see traces of human mana in them, not to mention that they are wearing armor. They would have to check where the battle took place. Arel says their work there is done, so they should return to the village. As soon as they arrive, the villagers almost vomit. The village chief says that before they talk, they should urgently take a bath. Arel asks if they smell that bad. Sena says it's normal since they ran around rotten corpses all night. After the bath, they gather, and Reki shows that the undead were contained. Arel celebrates, saying he fulfilled his promise, and now they can talk about the job. Abena says she never imagined it would be resolved so quickly. The protagonist says his family has always been very empathetic, and finally, he would also take care of the Lord of the Lands so they wouldn't have any more problems with this. Abena says she doesn't even know how to thank them. Arel says that instead of thanking, he hopes Abena takes the proposal seriously. The protagonist emphasizes that he wants to hire young talents from the village to be the bank's exclusive security. The details of this would be explained in the contract. Arel affirms that Abena wouldn't be decommissioned since she takes good care of her people. Abena listens and says that if the protagonist said and did all this, then she agrees. Thus, the negotiations with the village of Nachapanil were concluded, and now there was only one step left for Arel to take. In the royal castle of Ernesia, a royal conference was taking place. The protagonist stands up and says that his plan this time is to open a bank in the name of the kingdom. The details were in the plan presented to them, but it all comes down to an establishment that stores and lends money. One of the people there says they don't understand and asks if it wouldn't be better to store the money in a secure mansion. Arel says they can store the money in a mansion, but he asks if it would really be safe and if they have never worried about being robbed. The protagonist begins to think that someone set fire to the territory with a large fireball, as happened with concubine Elia, and that is scary. He emphasizes that his goal is to create a safe bank that no one will be able to touch. It needs guards as skilled as knights, and a security system developed with his technology. Arel says that storing money is just one of the bank's functions, but the most important is the part of lending money. They ask if the protagonist would lend money to people at no cost. Arel explains that they would only lend money to people who can pay back properly and would receive a percentage of the amount in return periodically, the famous interest. A man asks what would happen if this person didn't pay back the money they borrowed. The protagonist starts laughing in a scary way and asks the man what he thinks would happen. The man gets very scared, but the protagonist thinks it was just a joke. Aurel says that in the future, there will be more gold coins circulating in the kingdom, and that banks are a way to organize this flow. Therefore, as soon as the banks are established, he also plans to distribute coins that can replace gold coins. The members of the nobility say that a bank is already a lot to handle, and now he also wants to take care of coins. They say they see no reason for this. The protagonist thinks he expected this. The opposition is strong. However, Aurel explains to them that the current currency is mixed with counterfeit gold coins, not to mention the coins from other countries that are mixed in. Therefore, the strength is irregular, and the market price is unstable. He says he just wants to take advantage of all this to resolve things. The protagonist puts his hand on his chest and says that besides bearing all the costs for the new currency, he would also guarantee the value of the currency in the name of the royal family. He says that this is his plan and that they can comment on it. The nobles look at each other and start voting, saying they agree with it. Aurel smiles and thinks he's so happy that before the conference, he personally bribed. No, that word is too strong. He merely obtained the consent of everyone. After the conference ended, everything was ready, and now he could start building his bank. In the palace corridors, Count Cain Rubet shouts at Dezel Prosh, asking if they were going to just let Aurel be. Dezel turns and asks Cain what he thinks they should do. Dezel emphasizes that the protagonist is a duke and has the authority to obtain permission and start such a business. Cain continues shouting, saying they couldn't let him be like that. Dezel asks what's wrong with letting him be, since they wouldn't have any problem with it. He turns and asks if hiding 1,000 undead wasn't enough. Dezel tells Cain not to bring his personal problems there. Cain tries to counter-argue, but Dezel walks away, leaving him talking to himself. Since there was no opposition, the bank was completed in a month. It is located on the best land in the royal capital. Aurel walks down the street, thinking he intends to establish branches mainly in cities or tourist destinations where commerce is greater. Unfortunately, having a branch in Fahelia will take some time. Suddenly, two people talking catch the protagonist's attention. One of them says he heard they can really borrow money at a reasonable interest rate, and with that, they no longer need to worry about exorbitant interest rates or tyranny. This way, he will be able to start his dream. The nobles also comment on this, saying the bank is finally ready. However, one of them still thinks there's no place safer than his mansion. The young man asks if he knows that recently there have been thieves targeting transported goods. The man says he is aware of this and is currently in a delicate situation because of it. The young man tells him that some of Aurel's carriages were circulating and a group of bandits was watching them to attack. As soon as the thieves realized they were banknotes, they thought if they managed to steal them, they could take a year off. So without hesitation, they start to act. However, the security that the protagonist had hired and trained starts to act. In a few minutes, all the thieves were contained. The man is shocked by the strength of Aurel's soldiers, as besides using aura, they took down the bandits in minutes. The young man says that besides all that, he heard that Count Cain Rubet was behind this, and it seems he will be severely punished along with his crime of leaving the undead unsupervised. They pause for a moment and call the butler because they want to talk a bit about insurance and ask to take a closer look at the bank contract. And thus, a new wind began to blow in the financial industry of Ernesia. After a conversation with Theorel, he asks Aurel if they should really do this. The protagonist smiles and says yes. His father starts pacing, wondering if they should really build a big city in Fahelia. Aurel says he is confident that Fahelia is a territory that can be further developed, and to achieve this, they need a developed city through large-scale construction. Theorel says he understands what he means, but building a city is more complicated than just talking about it. The king asks how he plans to maintain the city after it is built. The protagonist thinks that Fahelia is a difficult land to live in due to its cold climate. Even if the city is completed, few people visit Fahelia except the natives, so that's why his father is worried because this issue defines the success or failure of a territory that was barely saved. Theorel tells Aurel that no matter how good he is, living in that place must be difficult. The protagonist recalls the good life he has, and thinks it's not so bad. His father approaches him and says he needs to tell him a secret. He was actually planning to help the protagonist leave that land in a few years. He wanted to give him a better position. These words leave Aurel speechless and surprised. He thinks he has never heard of this, and that it must have been difficult for his father to make this decision, since he is the king, and anything he does can cause disputes among the nobles. The protagonist wonders if his father would go to such lengths for him. Aurel steps back from his father and bows, saying he doesn't know how to put into words the gratitude he feels for his father's consideration, but he has no intention of leaving his current territory. Theorel asks why. The protagonist thinks it's because his paradise is finally within reach. He doesn't want to return to a place full of nobles constantly fighting for power. It's normal for a person to want to go back, so he understood why his father was confused. Arel tells his father that if it were a common city it would be ignored, but his city will never be common. He asks his father to trust him. They look at each other for a moment, and Theorel sighs, saying that if this is what the protagonist truly wants, then no one will be able to stop him. Theorel says he understands and gives his permission. Arel celebrates and thanks his father. With that, the construction of the city proceeded very well. He informed the existing residents that construction would go ahead. Additionally, the protagonist gathered the best talents for urban construction. He remembers that Aiken said there's already a rumor among craftsmen that working with him would give access to incredible new technologies. This is great because talented people were looking for him. Arel tells them he wants to entrust them with a suitable residential area where the existing residents can live peacefully. Moreover, there are many things that need to be done. They will need to completely rebuild. One of the men there says the protagonist will need strong walls. Arel agrees, as there are many monsters around. Although he thinks that people living there aren't surprised by a 3-meter rabbit near their houses, or even when their lord flies on a griffin, he needs to consider the people who will visit the city. Arel says they should give maximum priority to security. He emphasizes that he has a perfect stone for the wall. One of those responsible asks what stone that is. He shows the stone to the workers and asks what they think. The man says the quality of the stone is undeniable, but they need an enormous amount to do the job. Arel says that won't be a problem since there's plenty of it in his mine, which was given thanks to his contribution to the war. The other nobles couldn't mine due to lack of technology, so it ended up that the protagonist got everything. He thinks there will still be plenty left after construction. Maybe he'll make a stone statue of himself. Another collaborator asks why the protagonist is building a city. It doesn't seem like he just wants a city for people to live in safely. Arel says he wants to turn this city into a tourist destination. He thinks that if he turned the city into a factory to create special products, it wouldn't mean anything. On the other hand, if he manages to build a tourist destination, he can pour his heart into it. He calls the people and says that when the time comes, he will talk more about it. But now they need to see the schedule. After long hours of work, the protagonist stands up, saying it took a long time because there was a lot to review, but he managed to finish everything. Now he can leave the rest to the craftsmen and take a break. He presses a control, and a portal opens. He walks through the portal and says this is his own paradise, where he can rest secretly. The name of this place is Arel's My Room. While he drinks, he says he could have built it inside the castle, but he wanted some privacy. That is his secret base. He has placed various items and supplies there, so now it is durable enough to be used as a hideout in a siege battle, where he needs to close the gates and defend the castle from within. He's very happy with it, and says that next time he will build it in a place with hot springs. However, he still gets a bit bored. He thinks the problem with the Middle Ages is that there's little to do. Most of the books are grimoires or novels for the nobles to enjoy. He thinks he would like to read a colorful and well-written manhwa. Suddenly he stands up and thinks that now the paper supply has stabilized, so the next print should be. With this, he realizes he needs to start his own business at once, not just to satisfy his desires to eat and sleep, but also as a feast for his eyes. He gets up and says it's time to make it happen. Suddenly he receives a message saying they are in trouble. He asks what happened, and they say an urgent letter has arrived from the palace. Meanwhile, the mage from before had already accumulated enough resentment. He gets angry because people call them dark mages just because they seek more knowledge. He strikes his staff and commands the dead, who were killed by the greed of those in power, to rise. The ground starts to shake, and the dead begin to come to life and stand up. A large number of undead gather, and the mage says that with this number, even the Dark Church will have no choice but to recognize him. He orders the undead to show the kings how strong they are. A soldier on guard says everything was peaceful for a while. Suddenly, he notices something and looks closer. He sees a large number of undead and shouts for this to be reported to the superiors. Arel reads the letter, which says that a large number of undead have appeared on the northeastern and southern borders. The number is estimated at several 100,000. They are gathering to cross the borders of the Kingdom of Ernesia and the Three Kingdoms Alliance. He doesn't like what he reads. Asha is also surprised and asks if all the war victims have become undead. Arel says yes, explaining that according to the soldiers who saw this, the number of undead matches the number of victims at the time, so he believes it to be true. Reki says that based on what happened in Sena's village, it was probably where the mage trained. She gets angry, saying that this is typical of an evil dark mage, and they are all terrible people with bad taste. The protagonist asks Reki to stay calm, as it's still too early to know who did this. He emphasizes that the undead were dividing and gathering to cross the borders of the Kingdom of Urnesia and the Alliance. Sena is worried and asks if they will have to send troops like they did in the war. Arel says he's not sure about that, as the royal palace has not sent any official letter about it. He thinks he can't be lazy now, so he needs to look more closely, but he couldn't find any solid evidence, only made some preparations. However, he didn't imagine there were so many of them. He falls to his knees, shouting that the appearance of the undead not only stopped commerce, but also the construction of his city, and this is a huge inconvenience. The protagonist says the undead might enter his territory, so he asks the two to tell everyone to reinforce security. He tells them not to worry so much, as he has a plan. Arel thinks that whenever there is a problem, he should consider it an opportunity. He must take advantage of this to gain more time. Meanwhile, at the border fortress, chaos was unfolding. The dead were trying to enter the fortress. A soldier looks at them and says they never end. Another shouts, asking about the current situation. The soldiers say they managed to set up the defense in time, so they didn't suffer major damage. As the commander had ordered, they were dealing with the undead that were digging into the castle walls. The commander thinks he couldn't believe it when he heard about the undead, but thanks to them, he survived. He orders the soldiers to maintain the defense until they receive more orders from the royal castle. In the royal castle of Urnesia, Theorel shouts to issue an evacuation order for the residents near the border. In the worst-case scenario, abandon the fortress. He pauses for a moment and thinks he is glad that Arel suggested making preparations. Otherwise, they would have already suffered significant damage. Suddenly, the nobles call upon the king and say that simply waiting will not yield results. They need to find a way to resolve this once and for all. The king responds that this kind of incident is not recorded in history. He asks the nobles if they have any solutions. They suggest that the king requests support from the Holy Kingdom. The Holy Kingdom of Zelnian is a country specialized in dealing with evil techniques, such as necromancy, and curses used to command the undead. The king says that for this type of incident, the Holy Kingdom is indeed the best, but he doubts that the Holy Kingdom would help them out of the blue. Theorel explains that the Holy Kingdom has officially denied the existence of any beings beyond humans, according to their doctrine for generations. However, in the Kingdom of Urnesia, even beings of different races can obtain citizenship and be recognized if they have the capability. Due to these differences, the two countries are in constant conflict, even if it is not publicly shown. The king says he doesn't know what they would demand in exchange for their help. Perhaps they would require one or two conditions. One of the nobles, who is an elf, agrees that this is true. The Holy Kingdom might even deport or discriminate against members of other races. Theorel states that due to these facts, requesting help from the Holy Kingdom will be the last resort. The king thinks that he cannot be stubborn. If the danger starts to grow, he won't be able to hesitate in asking for support from the Holy Kingdom. Suddenly, the butler calls the king and says he needs to look at something immediately. He takes the letter and reads it, beginning to smile. The nobles ask what was in the letter. Theorel says that he thinks there will be no need to be indebted to the Holy Kingdom because Arel mentioned that there is a way. Meanwhile, in the Merman Empire, the cities were under attack. People were screaming that the undead were coming and begging for help. The soldiers on the wall ask what they wanted. The people plead for the gates to be opened, or else they would be killing the entire population. The reports reach the current emperor of the empire, Sarao. They say that the undead have crossed the border and are causing damage to the village. The villagers are banging on the gate, begging for help. Ilan Amrete Janil, the emperor, thinks this is the worst possible scenario. The emperor thinks that the previous emperor abandoned the throne after the defeat in the war, but they were still busy trying to resolve the citizens' distrust. And now, he has to deal with an army of the undead. Ilan asks if they could get support from allied kingdoms. However, his advisors say that it would be very difficult, as they are also in a direct situation. One of the nobles says that the Holy Kingdom announced that they intended to save them, but they would need to accept their offer. Without thinking twice, Emperor Island says there is no other way, and asks to request the support of the Holy Kingdom. The nobles are a bit apprehensive about this, but the emperor says they have no other choice. They need to prepare to welcome the Empress of the Holy Kingdom. Ilan thinks that it is already clear they will try to interfere in the internal affairs of the empire in the future. But there is no more time to worry about that. The main reason why the Holy Kingdom can exert so much influence in the current situation is thanks to the holy water they distribute. Monsters flee when they smell it, and the undead are purified when they are hit with the water. Due to the high cost of this water, many kingdoms have studied for a long time to try to understand the secrets behind it, but all efforts were in vain. The Holy Kingdom uses this to help the affected countries, and in return for their full support, the countries must enter into ridiculous treaties, or pay an excessive amount for the supplies. Meanwhile, in the neighboring kingdom, they are wondering what they should do now that the Merman Empire has joined the Holy Kingdom. Although the conditions of the Holy Kingdom are absurd, the Kingdom of Urnesia is also a great problem. After the war, the power of the Kingdom of Urnesia grew significantly. According to them, they could not establish friendship with the Holy Kingdom, which is their opposing force. The king thinks that, still, it is quite strange. The undead should be causing destruction wherever they pass, but the Kingdom of Urnesia is completely calm. It's as if they don't need any help. However, the king thinks that it's not the time to act like this. He needs to think of something to deal with the undead. Suddenly, the butler comes in shouting for the king and says a letter has arrived from the Kingdom of Urnesia. The king cannot believe it, and without thinking, grabs the letter and begins to read. He is surprised because the Kingdom of Urnesia is offering a way to exterminate the undead at a cheaper price. Not long ago in Fahilia, Damon asks the protagonist if he wants to recreate holy water. RL shows a small vial of holy water and says he spent a lot of money to get it, and it's not just water, but has a mysterious condensation of mana. He did some analysis and deduced that it could be reproduced to a certain extent. Damon is impressed and says he expected nothing less from his lord, solving things no one else in the world could solve. The protagonist smiles and says now they are going to make money. Arel recalls that in one of his previous lives, the 45th or 46th, there was a religious state that ruled an entire continent. In that life, there was a saint who earned the protagonist's recognition, and she was the only one throughout his life. This woman was not just someone supported by others, she was a person truly devoted to others and wanted peace in the world. He remembers a conversation where she said that the amount of holy water she could make was far from enough. It was too expensive for common people to use. She said she wanted to mass produce it so the whole world could use it. But for that, she needed the protagonist's help. The protagonist bows and says he would give everything to help her. Arel was comparing himself to her because he was purely moved by the belief and security she had in the peace of the people, to the point of giving up one of the main sources of income he had at the time. He thinks that looking back now it seemed quite immature. He continues his research and says that thanks to all that, he was able to make artificial holy water. Arel's holy water was finally complete. Damon is impressed again and says he didn't expect his lord to be able to do this in such a short time. The protagonist says the effect is a bit different from real holy water. While real holy water requires just one drop to solve the problem, artificial holy water needs to drench the target. However, the most impressive thing about this artificial holy water is that he can produce it almost infinitely, as its cost is almost the same as regular water. He says he will compensate for the deficiencies of his holy water with excellent production. Now, they need to mass produce and distribute it to the front lines. Meanwhile, on the front lines, the battle was still raging. The artificial holy water had already arrived, and the soldiers were throwing it at the undead. Once the water hit them, all the undead began to fall and lose their lives. The soldiers shout that RL is fantastic. They were finally dealing with the undead. The soldiers cheer, saying that the protagonist provided holy water at an incomparable price, extremely cheaper than the Holy Kingdoms. RL is a true savior. They salute Lord RL. A report reaches Emperor Ilan. He begins to read and cannot believe it, as it states that the Kingdom of Urnesia would supply to any country, regardless of past grievances. The emperor shouts, saying there is no way fake holy water could be effective. The butler enters and announces that a new letter from the Kingdom of Urnesia has arrived. King Theorol wrote a letter saying that he thought many countries would have doubts about this artificial holy water, and therefore his son RL Urnesia, the developer of the artificial holy water, would like to explain its effectiveness directly. He invited everyone to participate. This even reached the Holy Kingdom. Many letters were arriving for the protagonist. He was impressed, sitting and laughing, saying that everyone was asking to see him, even the Holy Kingdom. Reki asks the protagonist if he will really be okay, since he has never revealed himself for security reasons. He says it's all fine. Thanks to his business, everyone now knows he is a genius. She says she doesn't believe that's the real reason he's willing to move forward. Arel replies that she really knows him very well. He decides to explain to her and says that, at this moment, there are 3 reasons. The first is to make everyone owe him. He wants to engrave in their minds that they were saved by his invention so he can use it to his advantage in the future. The protagonist gets excited and jumps onto the table, saying that the second reason is that he would like to show off his charm. Reki loved all his charm by his animated face. He asks if there was a certain rumor that he was a weak genius of no importance to the world. He emphasizes that being called a weak genius doesn't bother him, but the image of being easy is a bit concerning. Therefore, he needs to show everyone how bad things can get if someone decides to mess with him. Reki says she already knew that. The protagonist says that lastly, if someone wants to steal money from them, he needs to do it personally. Now they are going to make money. On the day of the announcement, various nobles from different countries were seated there. As the protagonist walked among them, people asked if he was Aurel Ernisia. He looks around and thinks that the kingdom of Demaniel, the kingdom of Felvin, and even the principality of Kretchen, many of them were there. He looks and notices that the Merman Empire did not come, so it's true that they allied with the Holy Kingdom. He climbs onto the stage while people still cannot believe he is Aurel Ernisia, as he's still a child. He smiles a bit awkwardly, thinking he can hear everything they say. The protagonist begins to speak and says that the adoring looks from everyone are making him a little embarrassed. He introduces himself and says that probably everyone there is curious to see if his holy water has the same effect as real holy water. Aurel says it has exactly the same effect, except that the amount to be used is a bit larger. They start bringing a covered cart, and the protagonist says he knows it's hard to believe just words and documents, so he will show the effect directly. People wonder how he will do this. As the girls remove the cloth from the cart, an undead appears there. The nobles are a bit frightened by this. Aurel calls Sena and says they are sure of everything they do because they handle it with magic safely. He asks her to go ahead and pour the water on the undead. She takes the vial and pours it over the undead, which begins to scream in pain, and a few seconds later falls dead again. Aurel points to the undead and says it was completely destroyed and asks if they would like to see it again. However, all the nobles say that's enough. The protagonist realizes they are very weak because they were already nauseated by it. They look at the protagonist and think he is different from the others. They think the protagonist not only brought an undead, but also killed it in the blink of an eye. Clearly, he is not a normal child. One of the people present asks how much the artificial holy water would cost. Aurel begins to explain that, although artificial holy water is much cheaper than real holy water, each country requires at least several dozen tons, so the cost is high. However, he is aware of each one's financial situation, so he will not force them to pay the full amount immediately. Nevertheless, he also cannot give it away for free because he used his own money to create it, so he will accept future payments when they can afford it. Everyone thinks the same thing. This is a matter of debt. The Prota thinks that normally he would only charge for the water, but in this situation, it's necessary to exaggerate the cost a bit. Someone from the audience raises their hand and asks if they could ask a question. Aurel says yes. The woman asks if Prota's artificial holy water has anything to do with the holy water of the Sacred Kingdom. He thinks this woman is very direct with her questions, but he asserts that the two are completely different. She asks how. Prota explains that the official name of his holy water is artificial mana neutralizer. The effects may be the same, but the principles and manufacturing methods are completely different. Aurel states that above all, he understands that the Sacred Kingdom cannot provide holy water for everyone. This means that as soon as they protest against Prota, they will lose the benefits they had regarding artificial holy water, and that's all he has to say. He smiles and says he can provide as much holy water as they want, so they are free to make their choices. In the Sudates border duchy, the undead were trying to climb the wall. The commander looks at this and thinks they were coming in large numbers. In this way, it was only a matter of time before they broke through the defense. A soldier arrives, shouting that support has arrived. Artificial holy water sent from the Ernisia kingdom has just arrived. The commander is surprised and asks if this is true. As soon as he looks, he sees several barrels and shouts asking if all that is really holy water. They say to test it right away. The commander orders all forces to get ready. The soldiers hold their watering cans in hand. The commander gives the order to start throwing the water. As soon as the soldiers begin to throw the water, the undead start screaming in pain. They say it's working and open the gate, shouting for the soldiers not to be afraid to charge for everything they've done. The commander coordinates his troops, while Unit 1 neutralizes the undead, and Unit 2 throws artificial holy water to kill them. The soldiers shout that everything is going well, they just need to keep pressing on. The commander looks at all this and thinks he was almost giving up, and never thought the tide could change so dramatically like this, in seconds. He thinks that even though Aurel is a prince from another country, he is truly grateful to him for making this artificial holy water. The Trian Imperial Army, upon receiving the artificial holy water, began using it immediately. Each country used it freely in various different ways, managing to contain the undead. The most unique method among them was, the soldiers shout that the first round of artificial holy water arrows was loaded. Two of them talk to each other, and one asks if those weapons aren't the ones under the supervision of the king in the royal palace. The other says they had permission to use them. They fill the arrows with holy water. Prota says it's dangerous for them to get too close to the undead to throw holy water, so they just need to hit them with these arrows filled with water. They shoot the arrows with the crossbows. The undead just look at the arrows. The water hits them. The nobles are shocked at the effectiveness of the attack. They celebrate, saying it was great, as they were already tired of the undead. Everyone was thinking they should thank Arel for providing such cheap holy water. Thus, they could use it freely. The commander shouts for the soldiers to prepare for the second launch. Night falls, and the dark mage trembles with anger. He kneels on the ground, shouting that the hundreds of undead he created were killed in a week, leaving only a few. He says that if everything had gone right, all the kings would be crawling at his feet. Now, everything was destroyed, and it's Arel Ernesia's fault. The mage thinks that even though the holy water of the sacred kingdom was annoying, they couldn't purify an army as large as his. However, Prota dared to create artificial holy water. He thinks he needs to expel the mages from the magic tower who look at him and open the era of the dark church. He can't just stay silent and suffer like this. Asha reads a letter that says the remaining undead are gathered in one place to protect the dark mage. Therefore, they hope that the subjugation forces will enter into gradual combat through cooperation. Prota asks if the mage really uses the undead as a shield. Probably, he only wants to prolong the miserable life he has. Asha asks what she should do with the protest letter that arrived from the Sacred Kingdom. He just sighs and says to ignore everything, as it's annoying to deal with this kind of thing. And if they send more letters, just ignore them all. Prota takes advantage of the fact that they are both there, and asks Reki what she thinks of the Dark Mage, as he wanted to know the opinion of a mage. She thinks for a moment, and begins to say that maybe it would be a good thing if they could capture the mage instead of killing him. However, this is extremely difficult, since he is a mage capable of controlling hundreds of thousands of undead. She says she doesn't have much knowledge about necromancy, but she read a book that said the maximum number of undead that a Class 7 mage could command was around 30,000 undead. Arel asks her if she knows what spell that is. Reki says she doesn't know, but she imagines it's something very powerful. However, she emphasizes that sooner or later, the mage will exhaust himself and be caught. Prota thinks it will be a very difficult battle, and that it's a waste for him to stand still. Meanwhile, the battlefield, the soldiers realize that the dark mage appeared. One of them shouts for all the mages to use their magic there. Several magic circles begin to appear in the sky and shoot in place. However, the mage manages to create a barrier around him and block the attack of the mages. He shouts, asking if they really thought they could defeat him with such weak magics. He uses a bit of his strength, making his dark magic attack the soldiers. They try to run, but the magic is too close to them. One of the soldiers shouts for the other mages to use the shield magic immediately. The mage lowers his guard a little, and 3 soldiers manage to get close to him. However, he realizes and shouts that they are annoying, while using his magic to throw them away. After using a large amount of his mana, he starts to feel bad, and thinks that if he continues at this pace, he will be at a disadvantage. Looking at his hand, he realizes he is coughing up blood, and thinks his body is having difficulty resisting the enormous mana of resentment. He thinks this is disturbing, and that he will have to give up and wait for another opportunity to attack again. He raises his staff and shouts, "Acid cloud!" The soldiers start coughing and say it's poison, asking the mages to neutralize the poison with magic. The soldiers shout that they can't see anything. Meanwhile, the mage starts to flee. They shout for the mages to find his mana trail and try to locate him. The mage opens the door of a house running, dismayed at having to turn his back on low-level mages. He promises that everyone will pay for the humiliation he suffered today. He runs to his desk and thinks that soon the soldiers will find that place. He needs to grab only what he can and flee as quickly as possible. Suddenly, he hears a voice saying it's very disappointed, as he found nothing that he could use in his research, since the magic standard was too low. The mage starts to tremble. Turning around, he asks who the person there is. Prota asks what he meant by that, as the smell of undead was sickening. He introduces himself, saying he's Arel Ernesia. Prota smiles and says he came there to punish the dark mage. The mage asks how he found that house. Arel says that, thanks to the hard work of the subjugation force, finding his hideout was easy. He says he'll explain why he came there personally. Firstly, he was a bit curious about the dark mage's magic system there, and therefore wanted to take a look, thinking he would have good results, but found nothing useful. Prota says secondly, he had a question to ask the dark mage. The mage is a bit confused and asks why. Arel says it was for himself, as he awakened hundreds of thousands of undead and attacked from all sides, leaving everyone afraid. Suddenly, something hits the table near the mage and the papers start flying. Prota starts laughing in a scary way and asks what the hell was going through the mage's head to have such a grand idea. Arel says he can't understand that, so please explain it to him. With a scary tone, Prota asks the mage if he knew what would happen to him if he couldn't explain that convincingly. The mage feels cornered and in a moment of desperation, shouts releasing his magic, asking how a brat dared to speak like that to the great Nelfrin. However, as soon as he releases his magic, he starts feeling something that makes him choke. Nelfrin falls to the ground, wondering what just happened. Prota, with his hand closed, says his hand stinks now. Nelfrin gets up cursing Prota. Prota thinks that mages are human after all, and when a mage's brain is shaken, he turns into an idiot who can't even use magic properly. Arel goes to the table and starts reading Nelfrin's documents, saying his plan was to raise a large number of undead and invade neighboring countries. Prota says not even a child would think of such a plan. The mage, still lying on the ground, shouts asking how Prota dared to insult him as his army was. Prota interrupts, asking if he was going to say that his army was invincible. Prota spits on the ground. Arel looks at him and says that, comparing undead to soldiers, undead indeed seem powerful. However, he asks Nelfrin what he planned to do after his plan succeeded. He asks if the mage wanted to become king in a world full of undead. Of course, Nelfrin could at least pretend to be a king sitting on a pile of corpses on the first day, but he knew exactly what would happen in the end. That feeling of emptiness when realizing he achieved nothing real. Nelfrin screams, telling Prota to stop talking nonsense. He says all this happened only because Arel interfered, and asks how he dared to ruin the cause he dedicated his life to. Prota sighs, and says if things went well, it would be Nelfrin's achievement and merit. However, if things go wrong and everything goes downhill, blame someone else. In this way, things are really good for the mage. Arel closes his eyes and says he was foolish to think there was some ingenious reason behind all this. In the end, it was a waste of time to go there. Arel starts releasing a heavy and strong aura, saying it would be a waste to just kill the mage, and that's why he would end Nelfrin's life in the most humiliating way possible, making him feel the maximum despair. This would be for the sake of the people who were victims of the absurdity the mage committed. The mage starts to feel afraid and tries to use his magic again. Nelfrin shouts that all this is nonsense and orders his masterpiece to rise. The ground starts to break. A giant undead appears in front of them, with 4 arms. Arel says that's very disgusting, and there should be a limit to how much Nelfrin insults the dead. The monster starts screaming. Nelfrin shouts, saying this is his greatest work, made with carefully chosen soldier bodies. No matter how strong Prota is, he won't be able to defeat this undead. The monster starts attacking Prota while he thinks about how to kill the undead. He thinks he could simply crush it to the ground with brute force, but that would dirty his hands and could spread germs. Suddenly he remembers something and decides to try using it. The monster approaches Prota and says he will die. Arel raises his hand and says he wonders how many people had to die to make just one of these things, and that's why he will end this once and for all. A strong light appears in Prota's hand, hitting the undead. Arel commands it to be purified. The monster starts screaming and falls dead on the ground. Nelfrin screams, frightened, asking how Prota can use purification, a power that only the saints of the sacred kingdom have. Prota asks if the saint didn't patent it, so he doesn't understand what the mage is complaining about. Nelfrin starts to despair, saying the magic Prota just used is at the same level as a saint's. In fact, it was even more powerful than that of a saint. Arel thinks that what he used is a power similar to purification, so it's less powerful than the original. He wonders if the saint of that world is really that weak. Prota looks at the mage and thinks maybe that's his limit. It wouldn't be fun anymore. Nelfrin, trembling, tells Arel not to come near him. The mage, with a trembling voice, says it's okay and he wanted to make a deal. Lying on the ground and trembling with fear, he says he didn't want forgiveness for anything, that he would pay for everything he did appropriately. Arel puts his hand on his shoulder and says he's very noisy. He raises one of his hands and says he's getting hungry, so they should finish this soon. The mage starts sweating cold. After a while, the soldiers arrive there, shouting that everything was surrounded. However, as they look, they are surprised. The soldier looks at a completely mutilated body. The body was unrecognizable, and blood was everywhere. The soldiers ask whose body that was completely torn apart. The mages say that, by the evil mana trace, this body was undoubtedly that of the dark mage. The soldier says that, looking at such a cruel and terrible scene, he doesn't know if he can be happy. As he looks aside, he sees something. Looking closer, he realizes it's a letter that says, "Don't worry, I killed the dark mage in your place," signed by the professional of past lives. Back at his home, sitting in his chair, he thinks that justice ultimately triumphed, and the end of the dark mage has come. He thinks this is how he's recognized by the public. However, it's impossible for them to publish what Prota did with the mage. He lies back in his chair and says it was horrible, but the research materials were brought back and city construction is back on track. Everything ended well. However, what makes Prota angry is that even after removing all memory from the Dark Mage and seeing everything, he couldn't figure out what the Dark Church was. Arel says that in any case, if anyone tries to do that again, he will kill again. And since he's done his good deed for the day, now he's going back to being lazy. In the sacred kingdom of Zelnia, a man breaks the water flask that Prota had created. He shouts, asking how he dared to falsify God's grace, and that he couldn't let that happen. He shouts at Saint Nelvinia, asking why she was silent about it. This woman is Saint Nelvinia from the sacred kingdom of Zelnia. With an expression like she used some different herbs, she asks the man what he wants her to do. She asks if he's suggesting that she should punish the Urnesia kingdom for reducing the damage caused by the undead and saving people. The man says that holy water is a miracle that only she could bestow. She asks if he's saying that a saint should act dishonorably by claiming exclusive right over holy water. She puts her hand on her chest and says she wouldn't want anything more if more people could be saved, and that's the only stance they'll take. She asks the man to stop doing useless things. The man sits down and says he understands the situation. Nelvinia thinks that first comes the Serrano Empire, and after that, Arel Urnesia. She thinks about him, not because of this incident, but because she needs to verify him at least once, and all for doctrine and the Holy Kingdom's desire. As things calmed down and time passed, Arel turned 17. While flying on the fly, he enjoyed himself and made the most of his time in his territory. Besides dealing with the undead crisis, many other things happened during this time. Fly found a new partner and had a baby. After managing to create Damascus steel, Aachen and the others were attempting to create titanium. However, the biggest change of all was the new city in Fahelia. Arel landed in the middle of the city and celebrated, enchanted by the colors of the buildings. One of the people responsible for the construction approached him and said they had prioritized building a third of the city as Arel had requested. He asked Arel what he thought. Arel replied that everyone was doing a great job and asked them to complete the other areas just as they had done there. While he was talking with the person in charge, some people began to approach. The residents started arriving to see the new city. A child pointed out that the buildings were quite large. Arel said that soon they would move to the new city and asked what they thought and if they would miss the old city. The man said that it would be impossible. A woman remarked that, if it weren't for Arel, they would never have been able to live in a city like that. The children started laughing, saying that the houses looked very nice, and that they wouldn't be cold while sleeping anymore. Arel looked at this, and thought that it all made him feel so good and wondered if he should really leave. He got back on Fly, and the person in charge asked if he didn't want to look around a bit more. Arel said that it seemed he didn't need to worry about the quality of the city, and that, at the current pace, it would be ready very quickly. Now he needed to take care of his next step. The man asked what that step would be. Arel just laughed and said that once the new house was ready, they would need to have an inauguration party. When he returned to the castle, Asha asked if he was really planning to throw a banquet to celebrate the construction of the city. He started laughing and said that was exactly it. He said it was very funny when he asked her to prepare for a party, and she was surprised. She apologized and touched his head. Asha paused and started thinking, saying that fortunately he wasn't running a fever to suggest a banquet. She mentioned that throughout all this time, Arel had refused and avoided all invitations and social parties from the nobles, saying he hated them. She said that for a moment, she even mistook him for someone else. Arel was surprised and said she didn't need to react like that. He sighed and said it wasn't anything special. He just wanted to make this fact known to the public before the city was officially opened. Arel explained that, although they had accumulated wealth very quickly, Fahelia was still known to the world as a rural village covered in snow, and as a result, only a small group of traders visited them. That's why he wanted to hold this banquet. Even if it didn't attract many people interested in the city, there would still be many people interested in him, so they would come. Asha realized that the idea was really good and said she understood. He stood up and said that just having security wasn't enough. They needed to promote the city, which was why he wanted to hear what she had to say. Asha was a bit confused and asked how her opinion could help. Arel said that although the idea of the banquet was very good, they didn't have the talents for it. Aachen was an irritable dwarf, Sena was a clumsy country girl, and Reki was a somewhat absent-minded mage. He pointed to Asha and said that, since she was from a noble family, he wanted to entrust this to her. Of course, he would help her with everything. She lowered her head and said it had been a while since she had participated in such an event, but if it was something only she could do, she would do her best. Arel was happy about this and thanked her. He said she didn't need to be so worried because it wouldn't be such a big deal. At most, a few very rich and influential nobles would come. And of course the king, since he was Errol's father. Asha started to sweat and said she would risk her life to prepare everything as best as possible. Errol told her she didn't need to risk her life. She gets angry and says that she must indeed because she is sure she will meet all his expectations. Errol says that if she wants it that way, it's fine with him. After this conversation, Errol goes to his room and wonders who he should invite. He says that aristocratic society is an uncomfortable culture where you have to invite people you don't like. He decides to start with the people he does business with, be they merchants or nobles, then the friends he had no issues with. He throws himself on the bed, bored, thinking that if he only invites the people in power, it will seem snobbish, so he needs to invite others as well. He starts getting irritated and crumples the whole paper, shouting why he has to think about these things. He throws the paper away, grabs a scroll, and shouts that it's not in his nature to worry about this kind of thing, and that's why he'll invite everyone. The invitations begin to be sent out. Some nobles start receiving them but think there's something wrong with the invitation. One of the nobles asks his son if Errol is really having a banquet. The son says yes, but he doesn't think it's just a simple banquet. The younger son of the family asks if this is something that important. The older brother replies yes and says that he doesn't understand it yet because he's very young. Except for his first birthday and coming-of-age ceremony, Lord Errol hasn't shown his face at any event. He is surrounded by mystery, never attending any social circle. Even Princess Kenya always participates in these things, but he has never been to any of these events. Even when people invited him personally, he said he was busy, and no one could say anything since he was also born weak. In other words, all the nobles in this kingdom are paying attention to this banquet. He thinks that if everything goes well, they could use this banquet to form some kind of connection with Errol. With this in mind, they start preparing to attend the banquet. Errol calls his mother, and she is happy about it, asking if he is organizing the banquet alone. He also calls his father, informing him about the event, and he says he will make time on the appointed day. People continue talking about the banquet, saying it was to celebrate the construction of the new city that Lord Errol was finishing. Meanwhile, Errol is preparing everything. He sighs and says that all this is keeping him very busy. However, he is happy and tells everyone that, thanks to their help, he hasn't had major problems and is very excited about tomorrow. The next day, people start arriving for the banquet. The guards at the entrance gate begin to see the nobles arriving and think that Archduke Carrot and Archduke Despin are there. They are extremely famous, and the guards can't believe that this was a rural area where, until recently, only poor traders passed through. Suddenly, one of them notices something that catches his attention. Their leader says they need to be organized and as quick as possible. As soon as they confirm their identities, they must let them in because they can't keep the nobles waiting for too long. Meanwhile, Errol looks out the window and wonders why they are coming in such large numbers. The banquet is only in the evening, but it's already crowded. He thinks he understands that everyone is keeping an eye on him, but doing this makes it very obvious. He thinks maybe the other nobles want to meet him before the banquet, but he is not in the mood to do so. One of his maids comes to his room and says that the guests are already arriving at the venue. Errol says he understands and asks her to guide them to their places. She says she understands and will do her best to serve everyone, as he had requested. The nobles begin to look around the city and comment that Errol has every right to feel confident because his city is at a very advanced stage of completion. One of the butlers approaches one of the men and says he will take him to a place where he can rest before the banquet. The noble gets out of the carriage, looking at the city, and thinks it is indeed beautiful and excellent, but it's a shame. He starts thinking that this city is in Fahilia, a place with strong, cold, and intense snow in the winter, where the ground barely thaws even in the summer. The attractiveness of this city is not good. However, he looks up and notices that today it wasn't that cold. He wonders if the weather has been like this since early morning. Observing the other people, he thinks this is impossible. That place has always been so cold that the wind could cut a person's skin. Someone starts feeling warm, taking off some of their winter clothes and wondering if they wore too much. They comment that contrary to the rumors, that place is actually very warm. The noble wonders what is happening there. Prota, inside his castle, tells his maid that the nobles must be wondering why the city is so warm. He smiles and says it's too early for them to be surprised. He wonders what their faces will be like when they discover the truth. Asha arrives in his room and says she has finished checking everything. Location, food, lighting, and everything else. She comments that, the way things are, there won't be any problems. Prota thanks her and says everything went well thanks to her. She responds that she was just doing her job, but asks if he really wants to hold the banquet there. He says yes, because he thinks it's a perfect place to promote and introduce urban architecture. Errol smiles and asks her not to worry since everything he's done so far has worked out. She agrees, saying that if that's what he wants, then it's all right. Asha says that if everything is set, she will check the other places. However, Prota tells her that she needs to prepare to participate in the banquet as well, so she should rest a bit. She is surprised by this and asks what he means by participating too. Arel responds that he already told Reiki and Sena that all his close associates would participate in the banquet as well. She is so shocked that she drops her notepapers. She yells at him, saying that this was too sudden and that she hadn't prepared anything. Prota says she doesn't need to worry because he has taken care of everything. Suddenly 2 maids arrive, and Prota says he will leave the rest to them. Asha is still confused about all this. The 2 start leading her away while she calls out for Prota. Another maid goes to him, informing that they received a request from the castle to activate the teleportation magic circle. He says it's right on time and goes there to receive them. As he walks, he thinks that he sent an invitation to everyone in the royal family out of courtesy, but they said they wouldn't attend. The concubines had no reason to accept, and Jeel is very busy calming the population after the undead incident. Princess Kanya said she couldn't return because she had gone out to challenge one of the kingdom's swordmasters. She is really focused on gaining merit and recognition. So, the people who will come. As soon as he opens the door and enters the room, the magic is already happening, and in seconds, his mother and Chaina appear there. Lavana is impressed with the teleportation, saying it's really convenient as they arrived at their destination in seconds. Prota runs out and hugs his mother, smiling and thanking her for coming. She smiles and says she wouldn't miss this for anything in the world. Lavana says that Theorel is also very excited about the banquet. He said that as soon as he finishes everything he has to do, he will run to Fahilia. Arel smiles and says he will have to work hard to meet his expectations. Prota thinks that, even if it's a banquet hosted by his own son, it's not normal for the king to go to a place like that. He calls his mother and thinks they can start now. Night falls, and the nobles begin to be taken to the place where the banquet will be held. As soon as they look, they ask if that's really where the banquet will take place, because it's just an open square. Arel thinks that it's normal to hold banquets outdoors, but usually this is done in a place with a view that pleases the guests' eyes. This is the opposite of the place he chose. Some noble ladies comment among themselves about this, asking each other if Prota made a mistake due to his lack of experience with these things. However, they could take advantage of this to get closer to him, carefully advising him. It seemed that everyone was disappointed. However, the city's lights and a few bright points in the sky began to light up. All the guests started looking at them, amazed, commenting that the night was as bright as day and wondering if those lights in the sky were magic. They began to think that Prota had transformed the square into a banquet venue just to impress them. Arel said it was still too early to be surprised, as this was just the beginning. They should look at what was to come. He started whistling and said that everyone should be impressed with Fahilia's technology. Prota began to take off his coat and said that now they should go out, asking if everyone was ready. Suddenly, someone arrived saying they were ready. As Prota looked, he was impressed, saying she looked beautiful. Sena was very embarrassed and laughed, saying she dressed up like that because she thought it looked nice, though it was a bit difficult to move that way. She thanked him for the compliment. He asked why Asha didn't come out and show the results to them. She started to come out but was a little shy. Prota said it wasn't the first time she did this and asked why she was so shy. She also looked beautiful and said she was young when she last participated in an event like this, so it had been a long time since she wore a proper dress. Arel smiled and said that both of them looked lovely and asked them to have more confidence in themselves. Suddenly, Reki arrived all dressed up and asked Prota how she looked. He made the hand sign they always made to each other. Arel took the lead and said that since they were ready, it was time to surprise the guests. They began eating and commented that the food was very good and of high quality. Suddenly, the fountain started making noises and everyone looked at it. One of the men nearby even choked on his drink. They began to shout that the fountain was opening. They saw a person emerging from the middle of the fountain, and everyone was impressed. Lavana was also impressed by what she was seeing. Along with Prota, his 3 associates, and a large statue of him appeared. He thought that now the final display of his technology and wealth was complete. Everyone was surprised by what they were seeing, thinking that this was expected of Arel. He began to walk and said hi to everyone, thanking those who could attend the banquet celebrating the new city. He said he was deeply grateful to everyone. He explained that the primary reason for this banquet was to introduce the city to all of them. He hoped that the nobles would be interested and that the merchants could envision good business happening in the future. And for everyone else, he hoped they would consider moving to this new city. Arel said he was very eager to show the city to everyone, but before that, he would like to introduce the last guest of honor, His Majesty Theorel Ernisia. Theorel said that as king and as father, he was very happy that everyone there didn't mind traveling so far to attend the first banquet hosted by Arel Ernisia. The two smiled at each other. Prota raised his hand, and an image of the city appeared. He said that now that the king was present, he would present the new city using their new technologies. People were impressed that he could do this with his hand. Arel changed the image and said that what they were looking at now was the city's commercial and residential district. Several windows began to appear in front of all the guests. He said that this would be the distribution window that would handle all transactions in Fahelia in the future, and would also become a place for a prosperous lifestyle for the residents. The nobles were impressed by all this. Arel also said that the city's security measures were in place. First, there was the wall that Reki attacked with all her strength and couldn't break through. He said that the rock used in the wall was harder than most steels, so neither the monsters living there nor any army could destroy it. The wall was also maintained with multi-layered barriers that further increased its durability. Prota emphasized that they could rest assured because he had asked a 7th-class mage named Payan to test the barrier. People are impressed, commenting that not even a 7th-class mage was able to surpass it. One of the nobles asks if he can ask a question. He says that the climate there is so hostile that people wouldn't be able to live peacefully in that place and wants to know if this would be a problem. Arel says that's a good question. He thinks that since they would be getting strange questions from common people, this person who just asked was someone he had hired in advance. Prota starts to say that probably all of them felt something strange as soon as they entered the city. The people are confused by this. He says that probably everyone thought that holding the banquet in an open place in this climate would be madness. However, there is a special magical device installed within the city. Someone asks if it's an agricultural mana house that Prota had developed. He wonders who asked this, as it wasn't someone he had recruited. However, he was going to talk about it anyway. So Prota begins to explain that yes, this is an improved version of the mana house. This is a newly developed model for the city. However, the effect is clearly different. Arel snaps his fingers and it starts to snow there. Prota says that with this device, he can not only control the temperature but also the wind and even the snow to some extent. People can't believe something like this, finding it so impressive. Arel says that no matter how cold this place is, everyone will still be able to live comfortably there. People ask if this is really true. He says yes. He smiles, thinking that people think he is joking, which is why his mages had to work overtime and he had to spend a lot of money. He bows before everyone and says that he is now finishing his explanation. He says he hopes everyone enjoys the banquet. People start applauding Prota. As soon as the presentations are over, people start running to Prota, asking if he already knows what kind of store to open and if he already has a space in mind. Another young man arrives shouting, saying that they would be the most suitable to open a store there. Another noble arrives and asks if the magical tool to control the environment can be installed in another territory. If so, they would like to have it too. Arel closes his eyes and thinks that all this popularity is so irritating that he is almost dying because of it. However, he thinks that for their future, he needs to endure this night. Then he asks who would be next. Sena looks at Prota and says that he is working a lot today. She comments that he always works hard, but today he is different. It's like he is another person. It's incredible. Reiki just wants to eat. One of the nobles looks at them and asks the other nobles if they are Prota's guards, as rumors have it that they are stronger than the Knight Commander. One of them goes to Asha and asks if she would give him the honor of dancing a song. She apologizes and says that she is on guard today. Prota looks at this and thinks it would be good if these guys relaxed a bit. Suddenly, several women look at Prota with their eyes shining. One of them starts running towards him, and he is startled, thinking that these elegant movements are so quick that not a single step can be heard. These ladies are clearly trained for the hunt. One of them reaches him and bows. He thinks that he must be their prey. She says hi to him and asks why he doesn't dance with her instead of standing there alone. He thinks that usually, it's the man who asks for the dance first, but maybe she changed the strategy because he was standing still. He thinks that there are many women his age. However, he notices someone looking at him. As he turns, he sees his mother and his nanny. They smile, indicating for him not to waste time and dance. He thinks that just because he is not looking for a partner now, doesn't mean he won't get married in the future, but his mother is so radiant about it that she even glows. Prota realizes that he made his mother worry for no reason and feels bad, so he should at least pretend that he is looking for someone. He takes the woman's hand and thinks that, above all, he mustn't be rude like an idiot. He smiles and tells her they will dance a song, but he is not used to dancing, so he hopes not to cause any inconvenience. The woman smiles and says it's okay. Everyone has trouble with it the first time. He thinks that perhaps the woman is a professional at socializing with others. Prota pulls her in forcefully, leaving her breathless. He holds her and thinks that he has mastered all techniques, from simple movements to dances suitable for social gatherings. She is impressed by his movements while they dance, and he thinks that he mustn't forget that one of his future dreams is to get married. The most important thing here is to dance and behave well because that way he will be noticed by everyone. So he needs to be very active today. As soon as the song ends, Prota lets go of the woman, and she falls to her knees, enamored with him. He asks everyone to calm down, saying he will keep company with any of them. Prota bows and asks who would like to be the next to dance with him. All the women start running and shouting, asking to dance, so he begins to dance with them one by one. After several dances, he falls to the ground, exhausted, thinking that those ladies thought they couldn't dance anymore, which is why they all went at once. Asha asks if he is tired. Sena mocks him, asking if it was necessary to dance with all of them at once. He shouts at her, saying she knew he didn't choose this, but had to. Aurel asks why they didn't dance. Sena, drinking a glass of wine, says they were on duty. Prota says that if she wants to use that excuse, she should first put down that glass of drink. As soon as he catches his breath, he turns to see how many are left. He sees a huge line of women waiting to dance with him. He is frightened and thinks this is going to be exhausting. He looks at Asha and asks if he could use that. She is confused. He asks if she knows how to dance and calls her to dance with him. Aurel thinks that, unlike Sena and Reki, Asha didn't take the opportunity and continued observing all the ladies, as if she were missing something. He begs her to save him for a few minutes from all those women. Asha asks if that's why he wants her to dance with him. Prota says they should call it a reward for her helping with the banquet preparations, because the chance to dance with him isn't easy. Asha smiles and says it's an honor for her to dance. She says that it has been a long time since she danced, so she feels embarrassed and insecure. Prota smiles and tells her not to worry because he will teach her again. He extends his hand to her and asks if they should. She takes his hand smiling and says, fortunately yes, and that he should take good care of her. The two begin to dance beautifully. Asha smiles and says that for a night, dancing with her lord is a great honor, and she never thought she could dance like this again. Aurel smiles and says that dancing like this is better than striking enemies with a sword. He starts to take control of the dance and tells her to relax and just follow the natural flow. Fighting and dancing, though different, share the same foundation. When she dances, she needs to follow the music, and when she fights, her sword follows her muscles and the flow of aura. The other girls were seething with jealousy watching this. Aurel pulls her closer, holding her waist, and says that now they would take it up a notch. She smiles and says, yes, your majesty. After several dances, he falls into a chair almost dead from exhaustion and thinks he needs a break. He thinks his physical body is still fine, but he is mentally exhausted. While drinking a bit, he notices a different person watching him. Other men were scattered, looking around. He becomes suspicious of this. Suddenly, Reki comes up to him and says that currently, but he interrupts her, saying he already knows. The number of guests has increased. Now there are uninvited guests here. Asha asks what they should do. Sena says she could go in among them and take care of them quickly. After thinking for a bit, Aurel asks them to follow him at a distance because he wanted to talk a bit with those people. They say that this could be dangerous. Asha asks if he recognizes those people. He says he might recognize someone, but not all of them. He smiles and says he will call those people potential clients. With that in mind, he starts to move away from the people. It didn't take long for one of the men to approach him. Aurel turns smiling and says he is surprised he came there, that it is an honor. The lord of the magical tower, Helman Melnia, is personally before him. Helman is surprised by this. He bows and says he didn't expect to be recognized so quickly and apologizes for arriving so late. The Prota says that, in any case, it's still a banquet, so he should make himself comfortable. Helman becomes curious and says they have never met before, so how did the Prota recognize him so easily? Aurel says that Helman was so interested in his magical tools that it was a bit obvious who he was. The Prota remembers it was he who asked the question about the Mana house earlier. Aurel says he is quite surprised to see that someone as powerful as the Lord of the Magical Tower would accept the invitation so easily. The Prota notes that he thought Helman was the second most difficult person to meet in person, only behind Aurel himself. Helman says he is not that great. Besides, how could he refuse an invitation from His Highness? The Prota interrupts, saying no, and mentions that he thought Helman would hate him for receiving letters from the Holy Nation. Aurel begins to wonder what Helman would do now since he deliberately brought up a sensitive issue. Helman says it's all a misunderstanding. They had no reason to accept such requests. The Prota says that, in fact, he already knew they politely rejected them. Helman says he is glad Aurel did not misunderstand. Aurel thinks that, in any case, this man is the Lord of the Magical Tower. The Prota thinks he thought he would be an old man with a beard, but he is quite young and, judging by his mana, he is real and not a proxy. Helman says he is the Lord of the Magical Tower and is very confident when it comes to magical knowledge, but he needs to give the Prota credit for all of this. Arel says it is all thanks to the hard work of the mages at night. Hellman says the Prota is being very humble since it was he who had the original idea. He also says that if Arel has anything to say, it would be good to say it now since they are just the two of them there. The Prota says he prefers to talk in a quieter place. It is not good for them to talk about something here. Hellman becomes serious and says that, before anything else, he wanted to clarify some things. He asks if Arel knew those people behind him, as they had been following him for a while and it seemed were not invited to that conversation. He asks if dark mages only wear black clothes. Hellman points out that he heard white was in fashion. Why don't they try to change? One of the mages gets irritated and tells him to shut up. Hellman says it's no wonder he felt an unpleasant mana. It seemed he wasn't imagining things. The three point their staffs at the two and say that Arel Ernacia interfered with their companion, and that the Lord of the Magical Tower would interfere in the future. They say they need the two to follow them silently. The Prota is surprised by this, thinking he made some enemies because of his holy water. Hellman says it's his fault since he didn't imagine filthy cockroaches would enter a place like that. The three begin to gather their strength and shout, asking if they would resist. They say that even though Hellman is the Lord of the Magical Tower, he couldn't handle the three of them at the same time. Arel looks at their magical power and thinks that the three are Class 7 mages. That's why they managed to bypass surveillance. Hellman stands calmly in front of the Prota and says the three talk a lot for having such a mediocre level of skill. With just one of his hands, Hellman can create several magic circles in front of him. The Prota is pleased to see this, as it is the magic of a Class 8 mage. The three mages shout that this won't do any good and begin to attack. Hellman says they are very slow and also attacks, making the three disappear from there. Arel looks at the sky, wondering if Hellman really sent them to another place. Suddenly the three fall to the ground trembling. The Prota is impressed, saying that must hurt a lot, and the three were still alive. Maybe this is gravity magic. The Prota looks at Hellman and thinks that his abilities are indeed very useful. He is the Lord of the Magical Tower for a reason. Hellman bows his head, apologizing. He says he tried to resolve it in the best way, but apologizes for using magic without permission, and that he will apologize formally later. The Prota says it's no problem, that thanks to him, the two had more time, not to mention that he was also curious about the abilities of the Lord of the Magical Tower. Hellman says he understands and asks if that's why the guards didn't make their moves. The Prota is surprised, and asks if he noticed that. Hellman asks if the Prota minds if he takes care of these dark mages. Arel says it's okay, and that he would be happy if he takes care of it. Hellman snaps his fingers and thanks the Prota for letting him do that. The mages disappear from there again. Hellman asks Arel why he had called. The Prota begins to explain that, in the near future, Fahelia will develop magical tools, but they don't have enough energy, and that's why he wanted to leave some of that with the trusted people Hellman has by his side. Arel says he was thinking of asking Pian, but the person in charge of the magical tower is right in front of him now. Hellman is happy about this and asks what the Prota was planning to do. Arel says there are several things, but they couldn't talk about the details in an open place like that. Hellman says he is very anxious to have this conversation. He points out that he would personally like to accept this proposal but needs to talk to the others, and therefore asks for some time from the Prota. Arel says it's no problem, and that he will formally contact them later so he can respond. Hellman turns and begins to leave, saying he will wait eagerly for that day. The Prota asks if he is already leaving, and asks him to stay a bit longer and enjoy the banquet. Hellman says he cannot stay away from his position as the Lord of the Magical Tower for long, as he has much work to resolve. Besides, he wanted to have a good conversation with the dark mages before they end up dying. He apologizes and disappears in front of Arel. The Prota looks at this and thinks that Hellman left openly by teleportation. He even installed a barrier device there, and they would sell it on the market, so he didn't mind the Lord of the Magical Tower testing it. After that, they return to the banquet. As soon as he arrives, his father asks where he was. Arel thinks that he can't say he met with the Lord of the Magical Tower to talk, was attacked by 3 dark mages, and Hellman defeated them all. So he decides to say that he had an urgent matter to resolve. Arel looks at his father and thinks that his mother said she was tired and went in first to rest. The fact that his father, the king, is there waiting perhaps means he has something to tell. The two go up to the wall and Theorel starts looking over the whole city and says that his son's ingenuity has never ceased to amaze him. Who would have imagined that he could build a city like this in such a place? He asks Arel if he really has no intention of returning to the royal castle. The Prota says he still has a lot of work to do there. Theorel says he understands and won't bring it up again. He notes that maybe it's better this way, him staying there where he can be as free as he wants. And now that he's looking at this city, he feels relieved. Theorel says that actually, Gilles wants the Prota to return to the royal castle. Aurel is shocked and asks why his older brother wants that. The Prota thinks that he was wondering why his father was drinking so much today. Theorel says it's time to make a decision. Aurel thinks that's right. It's because of the inheritance of the throne. Well, it's the perfect time. Now that the great Gilles has come of age, his reputation has increased due to the war, and he is gaining support from the nobles. However, Gilles wants the Prota to return to the royal castle and assume an important official position. The Prota thinks he is nothing like his witch of a mother. Aurel bows before his father and says he will contact Gilles later. The Prota becomes serious, thinking about the throne, and imagines that soon there will be more turbulence. After the banquet, the residents began to settle in the city. They were extremely happy with their new homes. The royal castle also gave its final approval, saying there were no problems. After that, Fahelia was finally opened as a great city. A month later, Aurel was walking through the streets, saying that everything is great. They sell fresh fruits there, and it seems they made a good decision in moving to that place. Both the residents and the merchants were able to settle quickly, thanks to the information they received in advance. However, even so, he never imagined the city would come to life so quickly. He thinks he has achieved the minimum standard for habitable cities. The residents, who were worried in the first days, are now well and happy. It seems he made the right decision to check things out. He is seeing many merchants he hadn't seen before. Aurel wonders if all this is because he mentioned earlier that he had plans for tourism and entertainment facilities in the city's development. He thinks the city is now well developed, and it would be very good if he could develop a new product for the city. Suddenly, he hears someone shouting, telling them to run over there, that there is a unique product that came from the other side of the sea. He thinks this is the Geotal Company, a trading association based in the kingdom of Felsen. From what he heard, their main focus is on products imported through water trade. The technology of ships in that world is still not well developed. There is even a saying that being on a ship is to die a dog's death. Aurel enters the place thinking it's a pity that the kingdom of Vernesia doesn't have a sea. Therefore, these merchants might have something he has never seen before. As soon as he enters, a man welcomes him. The man takes a good look at the Prota and sees genuine jewelry, a coat made of good fabric, clean and new shoes that seem to have never gone through anything too rough. The merchant thinks this is going to be a great deal. He begins to introduce the business, saying that they trade products that come from beyond the continent. He notes that they have different meat and clothes that come from another country. Aurel looks around and thinks that nothing particularly catches his attention until he sees something different. The merchant says they also have medicinal herbs that are good for the body. The Prota gets serious and asks the man what that is. The man apologizes and says those seeds aren't good. Even though they import them, they are very bitter, so they can't be eaten or used in medicine. Aurel crouches down to get a better look and asks again for the name of the seed. The seller says that as far as he remembers, when he did business there, they called it cacao. Aurel grabs the seed, thrilled to have found it there. The Prota shouts for him to give all he has, that he will buy them. The seller asks why he wants those bad things, and he tells the guy to hurry up. After that, he returns to his castle. Asha says that lately, Aurel has been very busy. Sena agrees and says he indeed has been very busy, although she has no idea what he is going to do with that seed. But she's sure he will do something big again. In another room of the castle, the mages were sweaty from working so hard. However, they celebrate, saying it was a success. A large cacao tree was there. Aurel looks at the fruits and thinks they adjusted the growing environment, improved the plant, and thus the cacao tree was born with meticulous effort. Although they lost half the seeds on the first attempt, seeing this large cacao tree in just a month makes him want to cry with joy. Overjoyed, he turns excitedly and tells Reki that he will leave the most important job to her. She asks him to give the order. He smiles broadly, pointing to the seeds, saying she will help him grind and process the seeds. Although this is a waste of the greatest magic talent in the territory, it is the best method to do it. Using magic, she starts to take the seeds and process them, turning them into chocolate. She asks if that is enough, singing with happiness. The Prota says yes, it is perfect. He says that for her effort and work, he will let her taste it first, as soon as everything is ready. Mouth-watering, she says she is looking at it and it seems very good. She continues using her magic to continue the work. Aurel thinks the speed with which she does that is incredible. It seems she realized it is not an ordinary food. After everything, they add some milk and mix. Aurel checks the smell and is enchanted. He thinks this is really chocolate, the king of snacks. He thinks he was so eager to eat this, as there were no seeds of it until now, not even in his previous life. He tastes a little and is amazed by the sweet taste of the chocolate. The Prota falls sitting on the ground. Reki asks if she can make more. Arel just celebrates, saying he is happy to have been born again. After everything is finished, he calls his companions and sets up a dessert table. They look, asking if this is the new product. Akin, known as the Angry Dwarf, gets furious. He turns to Arel and asks how he dares to call a busy person like him to show mere snacks. The Prota says he intends to sell solid chocolate and cookies as common products. He asks them to taste and honestly say which is the best product to represent the city. Asha tastes the cookies and bread and feels a very good flavor. She says her brother would love that. Arel says all the children in the world would love that. Sena, overjoyed, starts tasting chocolate fondue. She says the sweet and sour aroma of the fruit and the intense sweetness of the chocolate combine perfectly. The Prota runs to Akin and asks what he thinks since he wants to please the dwarves too. However, Akin says he didn't like it because he found it too sweet for him. He explains that for them, the less sweet, the better. So, he prefers that whiskey bonbon. Arel says he already expected that he only chose that because it has whiskey. Akin tells the truth and says their work is very hard and tiring, so high calories and sugar are something they will always like. The Prota is happy and says he already knew that. Asha says everything is perfect. The taste is so good that any of them chosen as the main product would be great. Sena says she had the best time of her life. Akin just asks to return to his work. Arel asks what he means by that, saying there's still a lot of chocolate for them to try. The door opens and several maids enter with their trays, shocking the three. The Prota says he was so happy doing this that he ended up making various different things. He says maybe it was because chocolate has a stimulating effect. He starts to laugh in a strange way and says that the real taste test begins now. The three scream, and thus ends another day of peace in Fahelia. On the second day, Arel said he heard the critiques and praises and tweaked the recipe a bit. Asha and Sena were already full, but Reki was licking her lips with anticipation. On the third day, the Prota comes with another product, saying it was new. On the fourth day, he starts to speak, but Asha touches his shoulder and, with her head down, apologizes and says she can't do it anymore. Sena agrees, saying it's impossible to keep eating so much chocolate, and points to Reki collapsed on the ground, who also gave up, and mentions that Akin had run off long ago. Arel starts to laugh, saying it seems he overdid it a bit, making them eat chocolates every day. They scream yes. He says chocolate has a lot of calories, and their blood sugar would increase, making them gain weight. So really, it's better to stop here. The three are shocked by this news. Asha says she misses training with them since it had been a long time since they did that together. Sena says it's a good idea, and Reki says she would join. The Prota sighs and says they won't need to worry about looking at chocolate for a long time. While they run to burn off all they ate, Arel says he will eat it all himself now, since he doesn't gain weight. After he made everyone eat chocolate until they didn't want any more, it was introduced as a finished commercial product. Some chocolate specialty shops began to appear, with some women offering free samples to people. In the first days, people didn't take them because they didn't know what they were, but quickly they started tasting and falling in love with the flavor. Inside Arel's room, someone was reporting to him that not only the local residents, but also tourists were coming from afar to buy the chocolate after hearing about it. Above all, the nobles are interested in it. He says it's the first time he saw such a reaction since carbonated soda. Arel looks at his uncle Lycan, thinking he had gotten much fatter than the last time they saw each other. Lycan reports that there is a steady flow of requests to sell chocolate to other stations, not to mention that the sales strategy Arel set up was a great success. A high-quality product not sold in general stores and sold only by reservation was sold at a high price, only to nobles, on purpose. But the number of people who asked for this extravagance really increased. He thinks he only invested a little more in the box and the material cost and would send it via teleportation, and that's why he sells high-quality products. Lycan asks if Arel plans to make more, because if they sell in large quantities, they can make a lot of money. The Prota says he would also like to do that, but he thinks it's a bit difficult since there is a limit to the amount of fruit they can produce in his territory. The fields have already been expanded to the maximum, so this current amount is the most they can produce of cacao beans. He says there is no territory in the kingdom of Urnesia that can produce cacao, so they would have to use the Mana House and several mages to manage to cultivate more, and that would be almost impossible. Lycan suggests they could do business with Geotal. Arel interrupts and says maybe he would do that later. Lycan doesn't like the idea and says Geotal was very interested. The Prota thinks that although it is known that the raw material is cacao, the recipe and technology to make chocolate are still only in his hands. And after they realized it would take a long time to achieve the Prota's technology, they tried to make a deal to build a connection with them. Arel says he will not negotiate with them now. He wonders why he should follow their proposal. as he made chocolate just so he could eat and enjoy it with his friends. He didn't want to make money from it. He says to wait and see the reaction for now. The prota thinks the only time he really wanted to make money was when he made paper. So he left those guys alone because it was annoying to follow everyone. The result of this negligence was war. If he repeats the same thing, he will end up losing the title of professional from his previous life. No matter what happens from now on, he will keep an eye on everyone.